IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. I missed my guy. Ryan Roberts is back. So actually, Ryan, we had somebody ask in the chat last week, does Ryan Roberts still work for Irish Breakdown?
Oh, no.
So I said, yes, he does. He was on a family vacation. So he is back, refreshed, recharged, and ready to rock and roll. Ryan, welcome back, man. We missed you.
I appreciate it, man. I appreciate it. It was, I would just like to say this, Brian, before I went, though, I was planning to do some work and be on the board a little bit, and you threatened to lock me out of all accounts. So
Yes.
I appreciate
Yes.
it, though. It was a great week. We got to go down to Disney with the little one and the wife and everything. It was a great week off, no doubt, but I'm excited to get back into it, man. I know it's recruiting doesn't stop. I see people committing over the break, not to Notre Dame, and some more visits getting set up, and it's crazy as always, man. But I appreciate getting back here.
Well, what's my number one rule? What's my number one rule for Irish Breakdown, Ryan?
Family first, man.
That's
Family
right.
first.
Family
Yes.
first, and that's
Yes,
what you needed to do last week. So, Ryan, we're going to talk a little bit of Notre Dame recruiting today. Brian Smith filled in for you last week, and we went through sort of the offensive board and just kind of talked about, what does Notre Dame need to do on that side of the ball to land a gap closing class? Sure. And we're going to do the same thing today with the offense or the defense. Now, the difference is the offense already has some gap closers in the class, like some true like top. Because again, what do we mean by gap closers? One is just the obvious. It's the best of the best. You're taking guys from other top teams. You're landing top players. You're clearly making a big chunk on closing the gap. That's number one. Number two, and I've kind of flipped it because I think it's important to put that one number one. And then number two, the other type is, does this make you better? Because if it makes you better, you're still closing the gap. You're just closing the gap smaller and slower. And so those are the two types. And then with this conversation, it's also more about, but it's not always just about landing a gap closer at a position. It's also about landing a unit that is gap closing. And I think when you look at the Notre Dame offensive line, that's an example. Like, you may not have 5 gap closers in and of themselves, but as a group, you have a gap closing an elite offensive line. And that's something that people need to understand too. Last year's receiver class is a perfect example, right? And there was not a single guy in that group that I ranked as a top 50 national recruit. Not one, but I graded them all out as 4 stars.
Yep.
And 2 of them as top 100 guys. And honestly, I probably should have had Rico Flores there. But I just didn't want to pull the punch because I was just like, as good as he was as a senior and just some of the things we saw from him, but the injury late in the year, and I just felt like, this is going to come across as like a little bit too pro Notre Dame, but he's showing already in fall camp or spring ball that he's a legit player too. So even though there was no Brandon Inniss, there was no Cardinal Tate, there was no Shelton Sampson, a guy that I believe is a gap closer. I still can't believe people don't have him in the top 100. But you look at those guys, there isn't that guy. None of them graded as high as Tobias Merriweather individually, for example. But as a 4-man unit, that is flat out a gap closing class. And so today, the focus is going to be as much on the units as it's going to be on the individuals. Because you can also have a great player at a position and not have a great unit. Perfect example is Notre Dame's linebacking core back in 2015. You had the best linebacker in college football, but as a unit, it wasn't a great linebacking core.
Sure.
So that's what we're going to kind of focus on today. And we have to begin, Ryan, with the Notre Dame commits, because it's kind of funny when you look at the class as a whole, where we are right now on defense, and we've got people losing their minds over the D-line class and linebacker class and safety class. And to a degree, Ryan, I understand it. I mean, we have our concerns too. But just want to remind you all that where the defensive class is right now is exactly where the offensive class was a year ago, when everybody's panicking and freaking out. When's Tommy Rees going to get another recruit? When's Tommy Rees and the offensive staff going to pull their weight? Well, look what they did by the end, because at the end of the day, it's what you do at the end. You don't get graded for where you were in April. You get graded on where you are at the end. Defensive class has a lot of work to do with the staff. But they do have 3 kids in the class, and I think that's kind of where I want to start, Ryan, is first of all setting the table for who they have in the class. And to me, the guy that I'll be honest with you, Ryan, that is the top defensive player in the class for me, as much as I love Leonard Moore as a player and love his upside, the top guy for me, Ryan, is Owen Wafel. And he was not a guy that as you know, I was not super high on Owen Wafel as a sophomore. I was like, okay, this is like a Kurt Heinisch type, which is fine, but it's just not like that needle mover. Owen Wafel as a junior was a whole lot better player, and now I grade him as a top 150 guy that can play nose or 3 technique or potentially even some 5 technique and a 3-down look, although I really prefer him the way that Notre Dame plays. I prefer him as a guy that's inside, and I think when he came to Notre Dame in January, he was 292. Yep. He's got very long arms. This is a kid that they got early, didn't really fire me up. But when you start breaking down the film of his junior film, Ryan, you see a kid that is a really good football player. So much better start. There's a lot of concern about the defensive line, Ryan, but we forget this kid's in the class. This kid's pretty.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, like, I forget sometimes. I think we don't talk enough about Owen because for very simple, I mean, for some reasons we're very legitimate, Brian. I mean, when Owen Wafel committed to Notre Dame, he was a 6'2" and a half, 265-ish pound defensive lineman, right? Where you're like, right. Is he a strong side defensive end? Is he going to be a 3 tech? And he was coming off a sophomore year where, I mean, he played fullback on offense a little bit. He played defensive line, but he had like 5 tackles for loss and a sack as a sophomore, right? So you're like, the production wasn't great. He's an undersized defensive lineman. Like, you hear all the great stories about like his dad played in college. He's 6'6". Maybe Owen will have a growth spurt. And I mean, he did a little bit, right? He got up to about 6'3" right now. He's 290 plus pounds. Now he is very projectable inside, right? It's no more conversation about strong side end, maybe 3 tech. Like, this kid's an interior defensive lineman.
He's a 3 technique, or I like him as a nose. I mean, I think he can play nose now. I mean, now he looks like what Kurt Hinish did as a junior in college. Exactly. When you see him, Ryan, and he's a very explosive player. He's a guy that I've done a 180 on. And look, kudos to the Notre Dame staff. Kudos to Al Washington and Chad Bowden and Al Golden and Marcus Freeman, all the guys that were kind of a part of evaluating this kid, because it was one where they got him. I said to you, privately, I think they took him too soon. I don't know why they needed to take this kid this soon. Well, now you see as a junior, like, oh, well, I'm glad they got on him before the rest of America got on him, because this kid's a really good football player, Ryan.
Yeah, no, he really is, man. And he's a difference maker, because I think the things that you see, Brian, is like he brings the baseline, which is exciting, right? It's because he's going to be 300 plus pounds. He's incredibly strong. You could tell that he doesn't miss a workout, right? Like, he is a physically imposing player. But that first step's different, guys. Like, that's not a just ordinary first step for a 290 plus pounder. Like, he has the ability, I think, to play some 2 gap, but to be a 1 gap penetrator, to be a guy that can create a lot of mayhem and a lot of havoc in the backfield, man. Like, I think that we underrate him just because maybe we perceive them to, and I agree with you, because I was on the same wavelength. I was like, I think it's a little bit early for this guy. Like, he's a depth.
But you did like him more than I did, in fairness. You did like him more than I did. But you weren't like, oh, this guy's going to be a top 150 player when he was a junior. But you definitely liked him more than I did. So I'll give you credit for that. But that's a really nice pickup. Good way to start the class, because they need true interior guys in this class. I mean, they really only signed 1 true interior player last year. They didn't sign only 1 true interior player the year before. Now, some of those guys will move inside. Tyson Ford's already moved inside. One guy from last year's end class will probably move inside, but there's no true interior guys, and he became, in my opinion, a true interior guy. Yes, and that's an important one for me there. Now, he's not alone. Obviously, there's more in this class. Notre Dame has a commitment also from Leonard Moore, who is a Texas kid, Ryan, that as everybody knows, I'm very high on. You're very high on as well. From Round Rock, Texas, played against Braylon James last year. Obviously, they know each other well. Very underrated by most, although I did see that Rivals in their most recent ranking update ranked him number 150 overall. I think that's fair. I think it's a fair ranking for Leonard, but I think he's going to end up being better than that. He's a guy that I did give a 5-star upside grade to. He needs work, technical work, but long, athletic, and really fits into what Mike Mickens likes at cornerback. Mike Mickens, if you haven't been paying attention, his entire career, going back to Nick Johnson at Bowling Green, and then obviously Ahmad Gardner and Kobe Bryant and the guys he recruited at Cincinnati. Now you look at him now with Benjamin Morrison, who's only 6 feet, but long. You look at the guys he recruited, Christian Gray, 6 feet, long. Cam Hart, what he's done with Cam Hart. Mike Mickens likes length. Yes. And that's absolutely what Leonard Moore brings to the table. And
he's another guy too, Brian, that I think that the interesting part about Leonard Moore is that he also brings something that I would say is kind of a rare thing for his size, right? Like he's 6'1", 6'2", long. He's got that press man look to him. But the ability that he has to change direction for his size is pretty legitimate, man. Like it's very unique for him, right? So
you really see it when he's returning kicks in on offense. You really
can. I mean, because I look at him and I'm like, this kid, I think, is going to be a coverage diverse player. And when I say that, I mean that he can do a lot of different things, right? Like he's not just a press man kid. He's not just a cover 3 kid. I think he could play some off man at the next level. And I think that he can read and react, close downhill, and he can change direction. He can do a lot of nice things. And like you said, I mean, there's some false steps in his footwork. There's some, I think just
all coachable stuff.
Yes. Yeah. Things that he just needs to hone in on a little bit, things that he needs to focus on a little bit more, all technical aspects, all the unteachables that he has, the things that are God-given, length, athleticism, it's all there. You don't need improvement on that, right? It'll only get better as he's in a Matt Bayless strength program. He gets bigger, faster, stronger. But from a technical aspect, you love the ability for a guy like a Leonard Moore to work with Mike Mickens, man. Like that
Mike Mickens and Matt Bayless, that duo of Leonard Moore working with those two guys is what gets you fired up, and why I say, I mean, his upside is we're going to talk about some other corners on the board, but Leonard Moore to me, his upside is high as any of them, and I think the thing that you nailed too, Ryan, is that positional versatility. He can play field, he can play boundary, and I think he could be a cover safety as well in certain looks. If you're playing a team like a USC, and you decide you want to have Christian Gray on the outside, and you want to have Benjamin Morrison on the other side, or maybe Caleb Beasley some down the road, and you've got Micah Bell in the slot, and you want to put Leonard Moore as your deep safety to give you that range against a team like USC, against a team like Ohio State, makes a lot of sense because he has tackling potential too. That's the other thing is you don't see it a ton on his highlights, but you see it on game film. He is a willing tackler. And again, with more time on Matt Bayless, that's the one throw I love because he's actually not guarding that route, but he's playing that cover 3, and his ability to squeeze down is just really impressive. So I think, Ryan, that to me is a really strong 1-2 punch to me, to the class. Obviously, we've been honest about, well, I've been honest. I shouldn't speak for you. I'm not as high on Carson Hobbs as others. I'm not as high on Carson Hobbs as Notre Dame is. However, there are certain coaches on the staff that kind of get the benefit of the doubt with me. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to say that you made a bad evaluation. I'm not going to say you shouldn't have taken it. I'm not saying any of that because you've earned that. And Mike Mickens is one of those guys that's earned that with just what he's done at all of his stops at Bowling Green, at Cincinnati. Because if Notre Dame would have signed Ahmad Gardner coming out of high school, I'm like, seriously? Are you kidding me? This guy's not even a top 1,000 player. He weighs 145 pounds. What are they doing?
Was he a 2-star? He was a 2-star, wasn't he? Gardner?
I'd have ripped Notre Dame for that. I'd have ripped Notre Dame for signing if they'd have signed Kobe Bryant out of high school. Right? Well, guess what? Those guys are pros now, and Ahmad Gardner was a top 10 NFL draft pick. Mike Mickens knows how to evaluate corners. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. The thing I do like about Carson, though, Ryan, is he's a smart kid. He's a tough kid. And he plays against really good football teams and plays against in a very competitive league and more than holds his own. I mean, and shine. So if that's your worst kid, I can live that. And look, flip the kid from an SEC school. I can dig that. I'll take that. So it's a good foundation. You're pretty much met your needs at corner. We'll dive into that one here next, Ryan. But where they are right now is obviously hold on to the kids that they have, which I'm confident they will. And now it's building on it. And I think that we'll just kind of lead into sort of what the needs are. I think and we'll start with just quickly corner. They don't need another corner. They want another corner. And we'll dive into that board here in a little bit. Safety, they need 3, especially with the loss of Brandon Hillman. D-line, I think right now you need to add 4 more. I think you could potentially go to 5 if the right guy comes, which we'll discuss. And then linebacker, it's 2 to 3. I think is a sweet spot for where they are right now when it comes to defensive recruits. So let's just, as we kind of dive into the board, Ryan, let's just get cornerback out of the way quickly. As we said, there's not a need for another corner, but they want another corner. And I'll say this, a third corner is what's needed for this to become a true gap closing class in my view. And really there's 2 names on the board. There was 3. John Mitchell committed to Penn State. I would imagine the staff is still going to try to recruit him, but that's going to be a little bit of a tougher one. Aaron Scott from Springfield, Ohio is on the board. He visited recently, likes Notre Dame a lot, but I think they've just sat in that number 3 spot behind Ohio State and Michigan this entire time. And I think he likes Notre Dame. He likes Mike Mickens. He likes the staff. But I just don't think Notre Dame's going to be able to get ahead of Michigan and Ohio State at any point in time. And I think Ohio State's the team to beat there. Then there's Caleb Beasley. I think if Notre Dame's going to get a third corner, I think this is the guy that they really want. This is the guy they've wanted for a long time. They thought they were going to get him this summer or had a shot. He goes to Tennessee. Tennessee rides that really hot start to their season into getting a commitment from Caleb Beasley. He has visited Notre Dame. He has remained in contact with Notre Dame the entire time.
Yes.
And so it's not going to be easy to flip an in-state kid from Tennessee, but Caleb Beasley's a different kid, high academic kid. Family loves Tennessee, but they also love Notre Dame. He's a Notre Dame kid. He's a Notre Dame fit. If we're being honest about it. So Caleb Beasley is a kid to me, Ryan, that's pretty much the make or break. That's the guy that I think the staff is focused on as that sort of that top guy on the board. And they're going to try to flip him. And there's no need to expand the board, to be honest with you, Ryan, like to a Marcellus Barnes, in my opinion, because you've got your needs.
Yep.
Now it's about, can you get a dude to go here? And I think getting Caleb Beasley completely changes. I like the corner class now. It fits with last year's class really well, which is a thinner, Micah Bell's lit a small, Christian Gray's big time, but he's, skinny. These are bigger kids in this class to balance last year's class. So it's a good corner class, but it's not a gap closing corner class, in my opinion. They need Caleb Beasley in this class for it to become that. It doesn't mean it's not a good class. It just means it's not quite where the last two classes are, because as much as I love Leonard Moore, I don't have him as high as Christian Gray right now. And I definitely don't have him as high as Benjamin Morrison, who I had as a top 100 guy coming out. But it's close. You just need that Beasley impact. And we'll see if they can get it done, Ryan. But that's really the key in this class of corner.
Well, I think that, I've talked about this before, but I think that the cornerback class just has a really good baseline to it right now, right? You have two good football players on the board. You have one that I think has legitimate upside to be a very good football player on the next level. But I think the key here is that you are shooting now not for a need, but for a want, right? Who can take you to the next level, to your point, right? Who is a gap closer? Caleb Beasley's a gap closer. That's a kid that helps to continue to transform your cornerback room into one of the best in college football. That's what Caleb Beasley can bring. And I would say this too, Brian, is if you have those three corners who are all bigger corners, right? You talked about Leonard Moore being right around 6'2". You talk about Carson Hobbs being 6 foot, 190 pounds, somewhere in that ballpark. And you talk about Caleb Beasley. Caleb Beasley is another 6'1.5", 190-ish plus pound cornerback as well. All three of those guys, we're going to talk about the safety board in a little bit, right? All three of those guys could play safety down the line too. So you might potentially strengthen a couple different positions if you're able to land a three-man cornerback class. So I think this is more an overarching analysis here, right? Is that not only does it continue to strengthen the cornerback room and you add a gap closer from Caleb Beasley if you get a three-man class, but you also just strengthen the secondary in general. Like, let's forget about cornerback for a second. It could strengthen the safety position potentially, because then you can afford to, like, hey, Carson, we love you at corner, but like, we got a couple dudes here and you could really help us at safety, man. Like, you might be a starting safety down the line. It's possible.
And they'd like to have a corner body, a big corner body at nickel. That's clearly who are the nickels right now? It's Thomas Harper, who is a safety, but is built like a corner. He's got a corner body. Yep. It's Clarence Lewis and it's Ryan Barnes. It's three corner bodies, right? Or corners. And so I think they'd ultimately like to have that. And look, guys, look at the schedule. Look at the schedule the next 3-4 years. There's a lot of spread teams. There, like this year, for example, Ryan, I would contend that we're going to see Notre Dame in nickel as much as we're going to see them in their base defense, if not more, against almost every good team that they play. They're going to be that way against Ohio State. I think they're going to be that way against Virginia, now that Virginia's running Robert and I's offense. And we saw Notre Dame do a little bit of that in 2021 against Virginia. They're going to be that way against Ohio State. They're going to be that way against Duke. They're going to be that way against Louisville. They're going to be that way against USC. They're going to be that way probably against Clemson, I would imagine, against what Garrett Riley does. So, what's the team they're not going to be that way against? Pitt? Navy?
Yeah.
Right? Like who's the big opponent on the schedule? Wake Forest, they're going to be that way. Stanford now, with Troy Taylor as the head coach, they're probably going to be in a lot of nickel. Oh, yeah. So it's important. So when you say you get three corners, like, well, one of those guys is going to have to sit the bench. Well, not necessarily. Because Tariq Bracy was basically a starter last year, even though he didn't necessarily technically start every game.
Well, and I think that you look at, again, I always go back to the Cincinnati days, right? When Marcus Freeman was there, when Mike Mickens was there, Brian, when Kobe Bryant and Ahmad Sauce Gardner were at outside corner, who was their nickel? It was Arquan Bush, who ends up moving to outside corner as a senior after those guys leave. So to strengthen your point as far as what they want, you look at the Cincinnati roots and say they had a 6 foot, 190 plus pound corner playing nickel in their defense, right? Like they didn't have Tariq Bracy at 5'10" and 180 pounds playing nickel, right? Like a true nickel body. They had a cornerback playing nickel. They even had Brian Cook at Cincinnati, who was a converted corner playing safety, who would come down in the slot and play a lot of man-to-man coverage at times for Cincinnati. So I think even expansion beyond the nickel position, because I agree, they definitely want a outside cornerback body at nickel. They also don't mind having converted corners at safety either. Like they like those guys that have versatility on the back end. Because what does that versatility bring? It brings the ability to be multiple, right? Like you don't have to run one specific coverage. You can run man across the board. You can run some 2-high stuff. You can run some single high, zone stuff. You can do a little bit of everything when you have guys that are versatile in the back end that can do a little bit of everything. So yeah, man, I think that they definitely want that type of guy. I mean, could I see a world where Caleb Beasley and Leonard Moore are the starting outside corners and Carson Hobbs is a nickel? If Caleb Beasley does end up at Notre Dame, I could see that 100% down the line because they have mix and match skill sets, I think is the best way to put it. And I think that it's really where the game is going today, man. Like you're even seeing it in the NFL, the age of, the nickel corner that's 5'9", 185 pounds, that's dead now, man. You're seeing guys now of the Jalen Ramsey body types playing a lot of nickel now. Like it's just a different game than it was even just 5 to 10 years ago. And I think that's the evolution of the game. And I think that's where Notre Dame's going with it too.
So let's move on to the defensive line, Ryan. I think this probably is the biggest concern for me. Not concern that I'm worried, but just the concern from they need a big year on the defensive line. Yeah. I think Notre Dame is at a place right now, Ryan, where they signed a very good defensive class a year ago. Now, for different reasons, and people, you're very hard on Al Washington, but they signed one of the 10 best defensive line classes in the country. Very true. It was. Here's a couple issues I had with it. A lot of all the guys are kind of the same guy for the most part. Devin Houston's more of a pure interior guy, but a lot of similarities. But the 3 ends are basically the same guy. Yep. And they're very similar to what you signed the year before. We haven't seen Notre Dame sign a true Viper in a couple of years. Now, they've had a couple linebackers that have moved there, but now that takes away from that great linebacker class that you had 2 years ago. And eventually, Notre Dame has got to stop stealing from other positions to fill out their depth charts. We see that in the secondary. Right now, your 2 starting safeties this year are going to be guys, most likely, that played other positions to start their career and weren't recruited to play safety. You've got to start filling the needs there. Defensive line, kind of the same way. So you've signed, in my opinion, 2 pretty good defensive line classes in a row, in my view.
Yeah.
We'll see how they pan out, but I love the Tyson Ford. They didn't go buy a Donovan Heinisch class. I think they were a guy short, numbers-wise. Last year they signed 4. I think numbers-wise they were good with the 4. Didn't sign a Viper. Now you go into this class, Ryan, and it's like you need this 3rd straight strong class right now, and it's going to take some work for them to get there. Having Wafel in the class is a great start because now how you fill out the rest of the class is going to, you could determine where you want to play him.
Yep.
And I think having Wafel in the class, to me, helps you with sort of your top recruit because when we look at it, we said they need to sign 4. We're going to kind of break this down into the must-gets, right? And there's one flat-out, absolute must-get in the 2024 class on the entire team, and it's a defensive lineman in Justin Scott. Like, that is the guy, Ryan, that when this class ends, there can be no excuses. You have to get that one done. You need Justin Scott in this class.
Well, I mean, we've joked about it a lot, right? But it's the prestigious Catholic school in Chicago thing again, right? A 5-star defensive lineman from a prestigious Catholic school in the city of Chicago, an hour and a half away from campus. And those things are inexcusable. They are 100%. When you have a kid, especially one that has had a big love for Notre Dame for a long time, like this isn't something where he's like, oh yeah, Notre Dame's cool. Like maybe I'll go there. It's like, he wanted an offer for Notre Dame for a very long time. And, we've gone down this rat hole of the backstory of, them not offering in time. And so we're not going to get into that too much. The point blank period to it today is on April 17th. Justin Scott is a must get in this class, and for a lot of different reasons, though. Not just the regional stuff, not just the Catholic school stuff, not just, defensive tackle stuff. This kid is a legitimate top 10 player potentially in the 2025 class when it's all said and done. He is that type of potential player. And when you look at your roster, if you're Notre Dame, I like a lot of what they have from the young guy perspective on the interior. I mean, we've seen what a guy like Jason Onye has been doing this spring, right? Is really starting to take that step forward. We talk about guys like Tyson Ford hopefully taking a step forward through the rest of the spring. You talk about Devin Houston, although limited this spring. You talk about Donovan Heinisch. We talk about already having Owen Wafel in the 2024 class. Like, all that stuff is really good, and it's very attractive for moving forward. But what Justin Scott brings is kind of that combination of upside and floor that maybe you're a little short on the interior, right? A guy that at 6'4", 6'5", 310 pounds from day one, he's not only going to upgrade the size that you have on the interior, he's going to give you playmaking potential at that size as well. And Notre Dame hasn't had enough of that. That's one spot over the last couple of years that Notre Dame has needed more of, right? Playmaking size on the interior. That's what Justin Scott brings.
Yes.
He's a rare talent on the interior that an hour and a half away from campus, a player that loves Notre Dame and wanted a Notre Dame offer for the longest time, you have to close on that guy, man. There's no excuse not to get him. You need Justin Scott. He meets a need. He's a regional player. He's a guy that loves Notre Dame. He's a 5-star potential player. He's a top 10 player potentially in the 2024 recruiting class. You need that type of football player on this team.
So we've talked a lot about Justin Scott over the years, Ryan. Everything that we hear from our intel, I know he had a good visit to Miami this weekend. We're going to hear that all the time.
Sure.
We're going to always hear about his good visits because it's Miami. Have you ever been to Miami and not had a good time? I haven't. But I still feel Notre Dame is the team to beat here. He's back to Notre Dame this weekend for the Blue Gold game. I believe he'll be back. He's at least expected to be back on campus this weekend for the Blue Gold game. And I like where Notre Dame is at, but it's about closing, man. And it's about the whole staff. And that's where they're at right now. I mean, it's not, you need Al Washington to do a good job here. And if they end up getting Justin Scott, he'll get some of the credit. But this is one of those ones you don't just put on the D-line coach by himself. No. It's got to be an entire staff getting after it. And they are. And I like where they're at. But again, you got to close because people are going to start throwing more and more and more at that kid. Let's just be honest about it. And you've got to continue to remind him, the opportunities are there for him at Notre Dame.
Well, and Brian, can I say this? Because I know we'll talk about a couple of other interior players that Notre Dame's looking at on the defensive line. But let's say Notre Dame just ends up simply with Justin Scott and Owen Wafel as their two interior players in 2025. I mean, asking you as a person that's covered Notre Dame for a long time, that's the best interior defensive line class since ? I mean, a long time, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm trying to think, Ryan, when the last time because they had the great DN class in 2016 with Khalid Kareem, Dalen Hayes, Julian Okwara, Adetokunbo Ogundiji, but the best defensive tackle class, I mean, you'd probably have to go back to 2012 when they got Jerron Jones and Sheldon Day is probably the last time. And if they're as good as that duo, I'll take that. And Justin Scott is built like Jerron Jones. He's just a much better athlete and a more consistent effort guy. Owen Wafel and Sheldon Day, it's a lot of similarities there. Shorter, long arms, explosive first step, similar body type, except Owen is a little bit strong, a lot stronger than what Sheldon was, weight room strength than what Sheldon was. Sheldon was never a guy that looked the part. If you ever saw him, Ryan, he just never looked the part, but he just was a heck of a football player.
Just really good, man. Yeah.
My wife, they used to do this thing called this Football 101 thing where it was they would do a camp for women, and they would teach women football, and my wife loved it. She went there and she had a picture taken with Jalen Smith and Sheldon Day, and you just see the picture and Jaden's just ripped up, and then Sheldon just kind of looks like somebody's uncle, you know what I mean? But you put the pads on and Sheldon can flat out play, and I think there's a lot of. Him and Owen Wafel have a lot of similarities as players, in my opinion. Justin Scott is a much better version of Jerron Jones, but that would be the last time I'd say they had a legit 1-2 punch inside like that. because now as a recruit, Justin Scott's also ranked higher than both of them. Or although Sheldon Day was a 5-star according to Scout, but that was back when Scout would literally name, if you're in the top 50, you were considered a 5-star, and I think he was ranked like 50th. So, but still, very good player. Justin Scott will be ranked higher than that, in my opinion. So, you got to get him, and that's a heck of a 1-2 punch. Now, anything you get inside beyond that 1-2 is just gravy. If you're able to get, and let's just kind of finish the interior board with this, Ryan. There's really 2 names on the list that I think they have a legitimate shot at right now. That's TJ Lindsey and Benedict Ume. Those are the 2 guys that they're on. I believe they're trying to get Benedict Ume on campus this weekend, I believe. And then obviously TJ Lindsey comes on campus this weekend too, Ryan. And so those guys are important recruits, because I would not be opposed to a 3-man inside class and a 2-man outside class as long as one of the outsides is a Viper, because of the fact that you got 3 big ends, field ends basically in last year's class, guys you expect to play there. So that's, and then of course you have Aiden Gobira, who's also playing the big end position right now in that class. So I would not be opposed to taking a 3rd interior player, Ryan. And I don't think Notre Dame would either if it was the right guy, in my view.
And at that point too, if you had an Owen Wafel and a Justin Scott in the class, like you said, it's just making a strength even stronger. But I think the 2 players that you just talked about, they're so different, and it makes it really interesting to me, right? As far as adding them to that group. Because you talk about a Benedict Ume, he's 6'5", 6'6", long, 265, 270 pounds, right? Like he's kind of that long cup of tea that like is a mound of clay, basically, right? Like he can be as good as he wants to be, but he's not near finished as far as how good he is.
His game is that way.
Yes.
I don't know how much more you can put on that body. I mean, he's ripped up. So, I mean, he's physically close to his full potential, in my opinion. I think he'll put some weight on, but his game is very much a work in progress. But
yes,
there's some tools to work with there. There's no doubt about that.
Yep.
And you don't see it get exposed as much because of the level of competition that he plays against. But he is a guy that is going to need work. But he's big and strong, and his straight line speed is pretty good. His lateral quickness, he's pretty tight-hipped, in my opinion. You may disagree with that, Ryan, but the burst is really good, and that's why I project him inside, because as an inside guy, that lateral quickness doesn't bother me as much at that point in time.
Well, and I think for me, Brian, we're talking about a guy, if he's your 3rd defensive tackle in the class or 3rd interior player, you're like, I can work with that, man. Like, that's pretty nice, right?
Yes.
But then the other guy, I love TJ Lindsey, man. Yeah. I really like Lindsey's game out of Arkansas, out of Bryan High School, who they've won 5 straight state championships, by the way, in the state of Arkansas, a dominant football team. And he is all of 6'3.5", 6'4", 285, 290 pounds right now. Like, he's a massive young man. He could also play nose to the next level. I think he could play a little bit of 3 tech. He plays on the edge a lot for Bryant, obviously, but he has that alignment versatility where he can play up and down the line of scrimmage a little bit. And a cool little update, Brian, I know that I have a piece coming out on him for kind of a visit preview for this week, but he was a guy that has kind of been maintaining for a while. And this is just like a quick update for people on TJ Lindsey, that he's been talking about end of the fall season, end of my senior year, I'll make a decision. So kind of closer to signing day. In my recent conversation with him, he talked more about making that decision earlier in the season. So coming up. So he seems like he's starting to move that timeline up a little bit, which is very good for his chances to end up in the Notre Dame class if they have the room for him. Because that's kind of been the talking point, is like Notre Dame likes TJ Lindsey. TJ Lindsey has liked Notre Dame for a long time. It's just about like the timelines matching up has kind of been the conversation point for me. Mm-hmm. And with that matching up a little bit, I think it's even more opportunity for him to potentially be in the class, because he's a really good football player, man. And if you had him combined with the Justin Scott and an Owen Wafel, that's a dominant interior class, man. That's a really good. The smallest guy in that group is Owen Wafel at 6'3", 292 pounds.
Right.
Like, that's just wild, man. It's absolutely wild.
That would be like the dream. You want to talk about the dream scenario? Give me Justin Scott and one of those 2 kids, and that's, I mean, with Owen Wafel, and you're talking about, okay, you've restocked and reloaded up the middle. You've
got some size. You got some size. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Let's talk about the edge, Ryan, because this is the position to me. Like inside, like Ryan, I mean, look, you got 3 guys on the board. If you just get one of them, it's a good defensive tackle class. If you just get one of Lindsey and Ume, that's a good defensive tackle class, right? because I see Lindsey kind of as a 3 technique, maybe a nose. I think he may end up being a nose because he's already 6'4", 6'3", 290 something.
Yeah.
In a duo of Lindsey and Wafel, I could see Wafel being the 3 and Lindsey being the nose. I think Wafel's a little bit more athletic than Lindsey is, but I think Lindsey's powerful and productive, and a guy that's not just a run. None of these guys are just space eaters, which is good because that's not what really Notre Dame does. And honestly, I don't think it's ever going to be who they are. So you give me one of those two guys, Ume, Lindsey with Wafel, that's a good D tackle class. You give me Justin Scott and Owen Wafel, that's a really, really good defensive class, tackle class. You give me Scott and one of those two other guys with Wafel, and that's a gap closing inside defensive line haul. Now, it's going to be hard to get that because I don't know if they're going to get Lindsey. I don't know if they're going to get Ume. There's work to be done there. They've got to close on Justin Scott, but I feel a lot better about getting a gap closing inside class right now than I do an outside class. Because even if you just get Scott and Wafel, that's gap closing class.
Yep.
Because you're talking about a top 150 guy, in my view, in Owen Wafel with a 5-star in Justin Scott. And you've definitely moved the needle in a big way with that duo. Get 3 of them, and you've gone a long way towards closing that gap inside, Ryan.
Yeah,
no doubt.
We're talking about being so excited this offseason that Jason Onye is up to 292 pounds, right? And Riley Mills up to 296. You're about to add 3 guys that are bigger than all those guys, just about, right? Especially bigger when them coming out of high school. I mean, literally, you're going 6'3", 292. Justin Scott is all of 6'4" and a half, 310. And then you got, again, if you get Benedict Ume, he's a little bit of a longer, kind of rocked out kid. But I mean, TJ Lindsey is 6'4", 285, 290 plus pounds as well. So you're talking about adding impact and also adding impact size, which is something that you need to get more of, right? I mean, last year, Notre Dame was a little light inside. We talked about this, right? It's like Jason Amalula is 280, 285 pounds, on a good day. Howard Cross is 270, right? 275, and now we're talking about your smallest guy in the class being potentially 290 pounds. Like, that's moving in the right direction if you're Notre Dame. So not only from an impact perspective on the interior, but also from the simple fact that you're getting bigger, something that you don't have enough of at Notre Dame. You would do that with that 3-man class without question.
Because Wafel at 292, if I remember correctly, Ryan, and you were there, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe wasn't Lindsey at like 293?
So right around there. I think he was about 290, 293, somewhere in that ballpark.
You're talking about 3 guys that are at least 292.
Yep.
290. Ume's about 280, 285 right now. He'll be 300. He'll look a lot like Darnell Campbell. You remember him, Ryan, from back in the 90s, played Notre Dame? Benedict Ume physically looks a lot like Darnell Campbell did. We're just ripped, just big muscular, just thick. He'll be 295, 300 when it's all said and done. So you're correct. You're getting big, but here's the key. You're not getting big and slow.
No.
Because all these kids can move for interior guys. And that's an important piece of this thing too, Ryan. Because you can't be a team that likes to blitz and pressure and play all types of different looks and you've got some big 330-pound kid that can't do anything but play over the nose. You can't run the offense that they want to run or defense that they want to run.
Any of those 4 guys with Wafel included, they could all play 3-tech if they wanted to, right? Because they're twitchy enough. But then you're going to be like, okay, but let's get them all on the field. So then, maybe Wafel plays nose, for instance, right? Maybe TJ Lindsey your nose. Maybe Justin Scott is a guy that's interchangeable between nose and 3-tech. Like, that's where that conversation piece starts as far as who plays nose. But you're not really – it's fun because I think I've seen people ask this on the board before, and it's a very fair question of like, who's the nose that Notre Dame's recruiting? And I'm just like, I think they could all play nose if you wanted them to, but they're not noses by trait, right? Like they're 3-techs that can also play nose if you want to, because you're adding a lot of
that's never going to be who Notre Dame is, Ryan. Look, the Lewis Nixes are unicorns at Notre Dame. They just are.
Yeah.
They're just not going to recruit a bunch of those guys, and they don't necessarily need it in this system, in my opinion. Right. And that's the other thing that people have to remember is this isn't a situation where, hey, you need this guy, or you're gonna be in trouble, or you're not gonna be able to do this, or you're gonna do that, or whatever the case may be. You're gonna need guys that can move and also have some size, and that's gonna be the key. So they can all move, and I don't necessarily. I mean, I want a big end like TJ Lindsey, who's going to, I mean, guys, can we remember the two best nose tackles Notre Dame has had in the last 30 years were both guys that came to Notre Dame as linebackers from Chicago, Chris Zorich and Bryant Young.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, they were linebackers from Chicago that grew into noses. And Chris Zorich was never really grew into a nose. And he wasn't really a nose. He was kind of a three technique, but he played some over the nose as well, I believe. But yeah, it's just kind of guy you're going to get. So inside, I feel good, Ryan. On the edge, a little bit of a different story. And I think the narrative about the edge is kind of interesting because I think some people, this is a frustration that I have with some folks, especially this is more on the message board, but a little bit in the chat as well, is if it's not an elite guy, it's a guy that's not good. There's just this weird debate going on. And I think the Smith twins, Jared and Jacob Smith, are a perfect example of this discussion. To me, are Jacob and Jared Smith like the gap closing, like, wow, you're going to go beat Georgia now type of players? I don't think that they are, but they're good football players who are being recruited by Georgia, right? Yes. They literally visited Alabama. Georgia recently, Michigan, right?
Yeah.
And so are they studs? I know you're a little high. I think you're a little higher on Jacob than I am Jacob, right now. I think Jacob's got a lot of upside. I think Jared's the better player right now, but he doesn't have the ceiling. Right. But they're both good football players. And so, yes, ideally you want to get the Elijah Rushings, and we'll get into him next. But I think as a fan base, we have to say, just because they didn't necessarily get gap closers here doesn't mean these kids aren't good football players. And that's kind of the conversation for me is I'm not going to sit here and try to convince people that landing in Jacob and Jared Smith is like, Georgia, here we come. Right? I'm not saying that. But they are still good football players. They still make you better. In my opinion, they still give you good depth, especially Jacob, because he's at a position where Notre Dame really needs a guy in this class. And there's other guys on the board. Logan Thomas is a guy whose upside I like a lot. Jacob's got a higher floor. Cameron Clark, I think Jacob's got a higher floor and a little bit of a higher ceiling. You know, you look at some of the other Vipers on the board, Ryan, that there's some I like. I like Malachi Williams better than Jacob Smith. But right now, he doesn't like Notre Dame a whole lot, although he's visiting this weekend for the Blue Gold game. And maybe you can make a move on him. So the reality is if you end up with Jacob Smith and Jared Smith, you just got two 4-star top 250 caliber edge players. There's nothing wrong with that. And I feel like ever since we kind of started really using this term gap closer, I feel like the narrative has become that if an individual player is not a gap closer, then I don't want him. And that's just nonsense. Right? Yes, I want gap closers, especially on the edge. You need to get those guys, and they need to up their recruiting on the edge of that type of player. But that doesn't mean that these kids need to be poo-pooed and dismissed as like some 3-star nobody that, Notre Dame would have taken 10 years ago. No. Or 15 years ago, because 10 years ago they were signing like Aaron Lynch, Stephon Tuitt, Shaq Williams, but that's a different conversation. These aren't settle kids. That's the thing that needs to be understood. And to me, if you're able to get a Jared Smith and a Jacob Smith in this class to go with the guys you have, now you say, okay, here's what we're putting all of our attention on now. Elijah Rushing.
The elite. Yeah.
That's it. And Justin Scott. That is it. I mean, and there's something to that. And I, there's good football players on the board. Are there any gap closers on the edge right now that we think Notre Dame has a shot with? No. We'll talk about that here in a second when we finish up with Elijah Rushing. But here's the thing, folks. When you look at Jacob Smith, Logan Thomas, Malachi Williams, Bryce Young, Jared Smith, and Cole Mullins, I think those are kids that right now Notre Dame has a pretty good shot at. And then Cameron Clark in there as well, although he's probably a little lower on that board. Yep. That's a lot of really good football players on that list. Are there any elite guys? No. I think Malachi Williams has a big-time ceiling, but he's going to need a lot of work in the weight room. Yep. But, Cole Mullins is a kid I like a lot. He's another one. Bryce Young has a very high ceiling. So there's some talent there. And we need to be able to differentiate between, okay, is this guy a good football player, a great football player, or a guy that Notre Dame shouldn't be taking? And there's not a guy on that list that's in the not shouldn't be taking category. It's, okay, take him, but make sure you go out and get so-and-so also. And that's where I'm at with this DN class, Ryan. And I think we need to remind people of that a little bit, that it's not gap closer or bust, because nobody signs gap closers. The entire signing class is gap closers. And the last one that did that, Texas A&M, most of those guys are gone now.
Right.
That's the reality of it.
Well, and I think too, Brian, it's like, for me, it's about Notre Dame stacking, right? Like getting good football players consistently year in and year out. I mean, the one miss was in 2023, you mentioned it, was you didn't get a Viper, right? The minute that Keon Keeley decommitted, like it just wasn't, I mean, they tried to get in with some guys like Caleb Herring and, those types of players that obviously ended up at Tennessee, Chadavian Bradley, who also ended up at Tennessee. Like they tried to get in with those types of guys. And they talked to some other dudes like Blake Purchase that ended up with Oregon, but they didn't get a Viper in 2023. Getting Viper types especially is very big in this class because, yes, you still have some young Vipers on the roster, like obviously Joshua Burnham now, but you need to continue to stockpile that, right? I mean, that is a spot where you need to continue to add impact talents. But at the end of the day, if you add, and this is simply hypothetical, right? If you add a Jacob Smith and a Malachi Williams, for instance, in a class of your Vipers, and you have Jared Smith along with Justin Scott, Owen Wafel inside, and then maybe one more strong side end, let's say a Bryce Young. It's a really good class, guys. Like, can we stop acting like that's not a good class? I mean, does it need to still get better? I think things always need to get better, right? Like, the minute you become stagnant at a position is the minute that you just kind of let teams have an opportunity to jump you, right? Or to close the gap on you and to be able to supplant you in certain areas. Like, you should never just be okay with being as good as you are. You should always want to be a little bit better. That's okay to feel that way. But ultimately, and yes, I know I'm higher on Jacob Smith, for instance, than some people in the chat, that we talked about, right? But if you, again, there are really talented players on this board. And people talk about the recruiting rankings all the time, Brian. You know what I care about more than anything is what does the offer list look like and what schools are pushing for some of these players. Like, that matters to me. And, I mean, you talk about the Smith twins. Georgia's coming after them. Alabama's coming after them.
Michigan.
SEC schools are legitimately coming after them.
Yeah.
Michigan. Like, there's legitimate contending schools coming after these players. So I'm not going to sit here and just listen and be like, oh, I can't. Like, someone in the chat is not going to tell me, and no one said this in the chat, so I'm just using this as an example. Jared Smith's a bad player. He's a bad player. No, he's not. He's not a bad player. Alabama would have offered him if he's a bad player.
On Jared Smith, because I'm not as high on the Smith twins as you are, but I still see them as top 250 kids. Like, there's a difference between saying, hey, this kid's not very good and what you're saying there, Ryan. But it's the argument that you're making about the Smith twins is the exact same one that I made about Benjamin Morrison 2 years ago. And when people would say, oh, yeah, I literally had people call me a homer and all this other stuff because you hype up all Notre Dame players. Well, no, I don't. Number one, I said, why do you think Kyron Williams blocked me on Twitter? Because I had him ranked as like the lowest ranked kid in the class, coming out. I didn't love Kyron Williams coming out. But the fact of the matter is the argument that I made then is, number one, the film shines. But number two, Alabama, Nick Saban doesn't go out to Arizona for just any kid, right? For especially a DB. That's Nick Saban's baby. He's a DB coach. Jimmy Lake doesn't push that hard for a kid for just anybody. Jimmy Lake is one of the best. Now, he's in the NFL now, and he failed as a head coach. But when he was a position coach, D coordinator, the number of DB coaches that are as good as him as coaches and evaluators of secondary players, you can count on one hand. And one of the fingers is going to stand for Nick Saban. And now one of those fingers, in my opinion, stands for Mike Mickens. But Jimmy Lake's in that. So that was kind of the argument. So these kids go to school in Connecticut, and Georgia hosted them for a visit. Bama's recruiting them. They had them on campus. Michigan's recruiting them. So you kind of got to look at it and say, maybe they know something that Driscoll doesn't, because they're not treating them like a borderline top 250 kids. Yeah. And so that's the thing for me is I'm that way. And I think I'm a pretty darn good evaluator of talent. And I'm still going to look at these kids and be like, you know what? They see something. So I've watched Jacob Smith recently, Ryan, and I'm watching the film and I'm saying, okay, there's some stuff to work with there. I see what you're saying. I'm not like ready to throw them into the top 100, but these are good football players. But here's the thing though, Ryan, this is kind of funny about it. It's like, yes, they got to close and there's some concerns, but we're literally complaining about guys right now that are like top 100 recruits, according to some. Jacob Smith is considered the number 103 player in the country, according to ESPN, and he's in the top 220, according to 24/7 Sports and Rivals, right? Yeah. And then his brother, I believe, Jared, is ranked, I think, by some even higher. No, actually not anymore. ESPN has him number 169. He's ranked number 230 by 247 Sports. And so these are top 250 football players.
Yeah.
Could they do better? Maybe. But these are good football players. And that's the thing that we have to remember about these guys. Now, here's the thing, though, Ryan.
Yes. Yep.
They're not locks to Notre Dame.
No.
Like, and that's the other thing, too, is like, we might want to pump the brakes a little bit on this poo-poo and the Smith twins because they're not locks. And if you don't get them, we're having a whole different conversation about what this class is going to look like, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And that's something we got to consider, too.
It is because they've been the two that you have felt best about for a long time on the edge, but it's still not like a foregone conclusion to Notre Dame, to your point, right? Like that's kind of, you need to obviously continue to close on them. I mean, they've been on campus multiple times, I think 4 times now, they've been on campus and obviously there's an affinity for Notre Dame, but there is still a lot of competition for the Smith twins. Like it's not just a throw in that Michigan, they are Notre Dame or lock.
Somebody said, offer lists and schools want to take their commitments are two different things.
Sure.
Here's the thing. Don't think just because you don't like a player that those schools don't. Michigan would take the Smith twins right now.
Yesterday. They would take them yesterday.
And Georgia's pushing hard for them as well. Like Georgia's trying to get them back on campus for another visit. You don't do that for some guy that they just offered and whatever. He's a backup plan. They like those kids. That's the thing you all have to understand. You may not, and I understand that, and that's okay. But there's just a lot of aggressiveness about how disappointing the defensive line board is right now. And my whole thing is, if you want to question their ability to close, fair game. But there's a good board in place right now. There is. Cole Mullins is a kid who's filling. Now, he's not ranked super high, Ryan, but he's coming up this week. That's another kid that we don't talk a lot about that I like a lot. And right now he's a Viper. He's a Viper now, but could end up being end up growing into a big end. I think he's kind of got the frame to eventually grow into a really athletic big end. He's one of those 3-star kids that not many people have recruited, doesn't have a great offer list, but I pop into film and I'm like, this kid can flat out play.
He is probably the most technically advanced of any of the ends on the board, Brian, because he is a physical run defender, man. Like he sets a firm edge. He plays at Mill Creek, for people that don't know. That's where Caleb Downs came out of last year. And they play some competition there in Georgia, folks. So they play some good teams. And Cole was productive last year for Mill Creek. He's about 6'4", 240 pounds is what he's listed at. Probably more in the 6'3", 6'3.5" range. But he is silly physical, man. Like he really sets a firm edge. I question, what the upside is as a pass rusher, but like he does all the dirty work that you want at the big end position. Right. If that's where he ends up, being a 265-ish pound type of kid, because he will be physical with his hands. He'll play with good leverage. He's a good player, man. He really is. He plays against very good competition. And you're right. We don't talk about him enough, but he is also going to be on campus very soon, on the 19th, actually. So he's going to be on here on Wednesday on campus at Notre Dame. So he's a player to definitely keep an eye on. There's no doubt about that.
Other guys on the board, Ryan, obviously this weekend at Viper we're going to know if Notre Dame's got a shot with Malachi Williams this weekend. And he's a kid who I love on film. But he's another guy, Ryan, that like you look at his ranking, and I'm going to check his updated rankings because it's been a while since I checked. But the last time I checked, he wasn't a guy that had necessarily a really impressive rankings list. Yeah, he's ranked number 205 by On3, 247 by Rivals. He's a 3-star by 247 Sports, and ESPN hasn't found the time to even evaluate him yet. But I watch this kid's film, and I'm like, this is a guy that's got dude potential. Like big time. He's just skinny. He's just small. He's just not a guy that's going to play as a freshman. But, I feel about him as a potential Viper the way that I did about Jeremiah Wusu-Koromoa coming out of high school. A guy, if you remember, a 3-star recruit that I ranked as a 4-star at 4.5-star upside. And he's got that kind of potential, in my opinion. He's got dude potential. It may take some time, but he's got dude potential. But so far, Ryan, you've told me he doesn't seem to be – he likes Notre Dame enough to come visit him for the Blue Gold game, but he doesn't seem to be like as fired up about them as maybe some other teams. Yeah. This weekend's their chance to make a move with him.
No, he is, to your point, Brian. he's probably 205, 210 pounds right now. Yeah. Like he's a very skinny kid, 6'4", 6'5", somewhere in that ballpark. Plays in Philadelphia in the in kind of that Catholic school league out there in Philly. But he is a twitchy, long, athletic kid, man. Like I think it's like the first or second play of this highlight tape, Brian. You see him kind of lay out for a tackle. You're like, oh, that's some length right there, man. Like he's got some long arms, big tackle radius, and he's twitched up. If he is developed properly, he 100% has due potential. I think he has 5-star upside. Like he has much
upside.
Ryan.
Agree.
Yeah. Someone asked me in a mailbag, I think it was like 3 or 4 weeks ago, of like to rank the defensive line board as far as upside and floor, Brian. And I'm pretty sure I gave the lowest floor to Malachi, but also the highest ceiling to Malachi. Like he's that type of player, man.
He's this year's version of Boubacar Traore. That's what he is.
Yep.
I mean, now he's a Viper. Boubacar is more of a big end, but Boubacar Traore, if you look at just where you grade players now, was I think my lowest or second to lowest defensive player in the class last year. Just as far as where he's now, he missed most of his senior year. He's very raw. But I think I also had him number 1, and you had him number 2 on your upside board. Like I could see Boubacar being nothing more than at best, a Nana Osafa-Mensah type, maybe even an Alexander Ahrensberger type, a guy that just shows ability but never is able to turn it on. Or he could be the best big end they've had since Stephon Tuitt. I mean, he has that kind of gap between the floor and the ceiling. I mean, I do think Boubacar could be that good. It just, I don't know. Where I knew Aaron Lynch at the very least was going to be good. Right? Like, he was going to be good. Stephon Tuitt, you're like, okay, he's going to be pretty good. Aaron Lynch is going to be pretty good. Will they be stars? We'll find out. But they're going to be pretty good. This is the kind of kid that you take a flyer on because he is from the North. He's not being pursued by Bama, Georgia, teams like that as heavily. But you say, if this kid pops, you're going to be good. And here's the thing, too, why I really covet him a lot, because they don't necessarily need him to – if Notre Dame was somehow able to get Malachi Williams, you don't need him to come in and play right away because you do have another year of Jordan Botelho. You have still 4 years left, 3 after this season of Josh Burnham. You still have 3 years, 2 after this season of Junior Tuihalamaka. Plus, Preston Zinter could eventually grow into that position as well.
He could, yep.
So you can take a flyer on a kid like that, and same thing with Logan Thomas, who I don't think Notre Dame's in a position to land him right now. I mean, I think he likes Notre Dame, Ryan. If you can kind of give the lace there, but he's a bit of a long. But he's another guy. He's not coming in to help you in 2024. He's not going to be helping you as a freshman. But you let that guy get some time in the weight room and things like that, he could end up being a pretty good player. Yeah. But I know you also feel that way about Jacob Smith. He's a little bit more physically advanced than those guys. But I know you are really high on Jacob Smith as a potential edge rusher at the next level.
Yeah, I think in my evaluation, I put a top 150 grade on him. Like I really do like Jacob a lot, man. He is a 6'3.5", 6'4", 227 pounds pass rusher right now. Right, like that was verified at Notre Dame. He's got good length for the position. I think when you compare him to Logan Thomas, for instance, like Logan is 6'3.5-ish, somewhere in that ballpark, and probably 205, 210. Like he's a similar body type to Malachi, not quite as long as Malachi Williams. So they're a little bit of more developmental guys. I think Jacob Smith is going to be 235, 240 pounds before he steps foot on campus, wherever he ends up. But I think that because this is just my opinion, Brian, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, because I'm not referring to you in this sense at all. I'm saying I think the perception on Jacob gets dwindled a little bit because people aren't as high on Jared, it seems, so that they're like, oh no, Jacob's not that good.
Yes.
Like the Smith twins aren't that good in general.
But I think Jared's the better player right now. Like in advanced, high school, I think Jared's the better player right now. The only issue I have with Jared is his size. That's I actually think Jared Smith's a really good football player. A really good football player. My concern is his size.
Yeah.
And then you see him in person, and him and Jacob have completely different bodies.
Yes.
Like they're not like Justin and Jason Adamiola, where one's a little bigger than the other, but they look like the same exact kid. These are not identical twins. They're fraternal twins. Yep. Jason and Justin were identical twins. And Jared has a completely different build and body than Jacob does. Jacob looks like, wow, that's an SEC-looking defensive edge. Jared does not. But then you pop on the film and you're like, dang, this kid can play. So that's the interesting thing about it is I actually think Jared's the better player. I just think Jacob's the better prospect right now. But they're both good football players. Another guy, Darian Mayo, I don't think they're going to – I think the staff is kind of not pushing for him as hard right now. I think that they realize that that's just not a guy they're probably going to have a shot to get. So I don't think they're necessarily pushing as hard. I think the visit went well, but I just think that there's other guys they see. Last guy to me, Ryan, is Bryce Young. This is the last guy I want to talk about because I have no clue what's going on with Bryce Young. Like everything we hear, he's going to come to Notre Dame. He's going to pick Notre Dame. And then, but he never tweets about Notre Dame ever. He has not come back on a visit in a while. He's visiting USC and everybody else. It's a weird situation because every time I talk to sources, I'm like, oh no, we're good. We're good. We're good. I'm like, it doesn't seem good to me, but I'll trust you. That's a strange recruitment right now. And a guy that we've had a hard time getting a hold of to talk to as well. So it's a very strange recruitment.
It's honestly very weird because I mean he was just at Michigan and you see him in a Michigan uniform yesterday, right? It's just like this is one of those, Brian.
He's been to USC as well.
He's been all over the place, man. He's blowing up from an offer perspective. Like he just keeps reeling in offers, right? Like everyone seems to be after Bryce Young now that he's up to 6'5", 240 and his body's really developing, right? I mean, for me, Brian, it's just one of those situations where I feel like I'm just kind of sitting back and observing, right? Like the actions speak louder than words, in my opinion, in some of these situations, right? It's like, yes, we hear that Notre Dame's in a great position. We hear that Bryce Young is, we feel, that they feel good about Bryce Young being in the class eventually, all that great stuff, but keeps going on visits, man. And he keeps posted, other schools' uniforms and whatnot. And again, I don't hyper focus on Twitter too much, but if a kid is still taking visits, that tells me that it's not a foregone conclusion, right? That there's still teams that are actively pursuing heavily. So I think that's one where does Notre Dame probably have the inside track that you still feel good about it? Yes. But also if he's still taking visits, I can't sit here and adamantly say like, yeah, I think Bryce Young is definitely going to end up in the class. Like I can't say that right now. I can't. Right. Because I was on Twitter yesterday, because I took a little bit of a break from Twitter, just a slight one. And I see him in a Michigan uniform, right? And saying like, go blue ? Like that's the facts, guys. Like that's not me speculating. Like he is going on visits and that's his process. He is welcome to do that. I'm just saying for the people that think it's just a foregone conclusion, not saying that it's I don't think it's a foregone conclusion is all I'm saying.
It was at one point. It was at one point. I just don't know if it is now. Yep. And I don't believe he's scheduled to come on campus this weekend either for the Blue Gold game, which is a bit of a head scratcher, to be completely honest with you. So we'll see how that one goes. As we kind of move forward. But look, defensive line, obviously we spent a lot of time on that one, understandably so. Let's move over to linebacker, Ryan. This one's a little bit easier to break down. There is one right now, absolute must get in the class of linebacker. Now, and we'll talk about that one, but I'm going to be honest, I don't necessarily agree. It looks like the staff really wants 3 linebackers in this class. I don't necessarily agree with that. I would like 3 if it can be the right 3, but I can live with 2, depending on who you get. But one of those guys, no matter what you think about the rest of the board, the one guy flat out right now that Notre Dame has to get is Kingston Viliamo-Asa from St. John Bosco out in California. It's not going to be easy. I believe he's going to be on campus soon. I believe they're trying to get him on campus this weekend for a visit. I don't know if we have him on that list yet. I don't know if we've been able to confirm that, but I know that they're definitely working on it. You have to get him, Ryan. Like he is without question to me the top guy on the board that you have a shot with. Look, we can talk about Sammy. We're not going to talk about Sammy Brown and Aaron Childs. If those guys make official visits this summer, great. I know Aaron Childs has said he's going to visit Notre Dame. We'll see if he's even still uncommitted by then. Right. And so right now they're just not in it. The same thing with Sammy Brown. Yeah, he visited and I know he likes Notre Dame, but I just don't see that kid leaving the South. I just don't see it. And if he does, it won't be for Notre Dame. It'll probably be for Ohio State, but I don't think he comes north. I think he stays in the South. So we're going to talk about the realistic candidates. And to me, Kingston is there's Kingston and then there's kind of everybody else right now at this point in time. He is absolutely the must get a linebacker in this class. And if you don't get him, it could get real interesting at linebacker. Real dicey.
Yeah.
Real dicey.
I mean, and so I did talk to Kingston before I left on the vacation, and I'll get like a little more insight, but he had said that he wants to visit sometime in April, but he did not have like a date locked in, right? Like that was the kind of the situation where it was that he still wants to get to Notre Dame, but it's like there's not a cemented date, at least there wasn't at that point. I mean, Brian, quite simply, man, he's a really good football player. He's a Mike linebacker, which I think you need more of, building through the future, right? I mean, Drake Bowen, I think, is a guy that could play Mike. Nolan Ziegler maybe could grow into a Mike, but like you need to kind of replenish, continue to get those impact
Nolan Ziegler
Mikes.
can play Mike, yes, but again, you got Nolan and Drake, and that's kind of it. But I don't know if I don't think both of them are Mikes only, pure Mikes. I think Nolan still, to me, is more of a Will who can play Mike. Drake is a Mike that can play Will, but let's say Drake gets hurt or doesn't pan out, or Nolan gets hurt or doesn't pan out. You know what I mean? You've got to get that guy. And the thing I like about Kingston too, Ryan, is he's a Mike that I think can play Will as well.
He can move.
He's not like Junior Tuihalamaka where he's a Mike or a Viper. I don't see that. I see Mike Will for him, and that adds to the value for me. I think he runs a little bit better than Junior did. Junior was powerful and quick and all that, but I think long speed, I would say Kingston has a little bit more long speed than what Junior had at the same age, in my opinion.
Well, I think if people want to pop on his highlight tape, I think it was like the third or fourth play on Kingston's highlight tape. It's against Servite, I believe, where he jumps a slant and takes it to the house, man. I'm like, oh, this kid can move a little bit, right? Like he's not a tackle just thumper. Like he's a guy that can play a little bit in space. I agree with you. Like he's a playmaking Mike, man. I mean, he on the best team in high school football last season, St. John Bosco, with, by the way, dudes everywhere on that team, right? Like Peyton Woodyard, Jason Mitchell transferred in at safety. Like they got Division I players at every single level and on both sides of the football. He was 111 tackles, 9.5 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks, an interception return for a touchdown. The kid's a baller, man. He really is a really good football player, and he's an impact Mike linebacker, I believe, on the next level. He's a guy that fits too, Brian. Like, I mean, talk about the interview I did with him for a second, right? He is a very modest kid, a very driven and focused kid, and he's also a very spiritual kid, which I don't think we can take for granted, right? Like his spirituality, his religious side, that stuff all means a lot to him, which is one of the big reasons that he is attracted to the University of Notre Dame. That is a big reason, right? So yeah, Kingston is a must get. He is the one guy that you feel good about, but you don't feel great yet, right? Like it's going to be one of those situations where you need to get him back on campus this month, this offseason, and you need to potentially really make some movement there, because he mentioned in my interview with him, he mentioned Ohio State, Notre Dame, Miami, and University of Washington. That were the 4 schools that he said were standing out to him at that time. He's been down to Miami. He's been over to Ohio State. You need to get him back on campus, because getting to Washington is a lot easier than getting to South Bend, Indiana, right? So getting him back on campus is going to be monumental, I believe, in this recruitment. And they need to close on a guy like a Kingston Villiamoasa, because it's an impact player. It's a Mike linebacker. And it's getting a really good kid out of the state of California at a kid that played at St. John Bosco. We can't discount that, right? Like a kid that is used to winning and it has expectations of winning. All those things matter to me.
After that, Ryan, so there's a big difference between the defensive line board and the linebacker board. The defensive line board, there's a lot of good football players, and it's just like, who are you going to close with, right? Linebacker recruiting to me is a much bigger concern, because I'm looking at this and I'm like, the guys that I think they're going to get right now, that I think they have a shot to land right now, are just guys that are just like, that doesn't move the needle forward. That moves the needle backwards. And you can convince me all you want that Cole Sullivan and Bodie Cahoon are going to be great players, and they're solid players. That, Michigan likes Cole Sullivan. Cole Sullivan's got some upside. You like him more than I do. Bodie Cahoon's a good football player, but that can't be your class. That's my whole point, is like, that can't be your whole class. Give me one of those guys and give me Kingston, and I'm feeling better about it. Then it's like, okay, go find me a Rover or go find me another guy. And there's a couple guys coming on campus this week, Ryan, that if Notre Dame is able to make I'll say this week is going to be huge for linebacker recruiting. 100%. You got to get Kingston on campus. There's 2 other kids coming on campus this weekend that I think if Notre Dame can make get some traction here and have a lot of success with, in my opinion, then the board to me looks a whole lot different. And that is Friday. Number 1 is you've got Chris Cole coming on campus on Friday. Yes. That's a kid who I am very high on, Ryan. Yep. And then on Saturday, Brian Huff will be on campus. And to me, if you can make a move with those two kids, I'm feeling a lot better about the board. And if you don't make a movement with those two kids, then I'm very nervous about the board. And so I think on top of, we think Kingston is going to be on campus this week, although we have not confirmed that. And I don't know if that's set in stone yet. But the other two kids, to me, if you can get those, now all of a sudden, Ryan, if you give me Kingston and one of Bodie or Cole Sullivan, and I think they like Bodie Cahoon more than Cole Sullivan, I think is where that is right now, as do I. And then give me one of Chris Cole or Brian Huff, my opinion on linebacker recruiting changes. It does a complete 180 over where it is right now. Complete 180.
Sure.
That would be a really good linebacker class, because you've got the high floor, high ceiling guy in Kingston. You've got a high floor, okay ceiling in Bodie Cahoon. And then the other two kids, Huff and Cole, especially Cole, are very high ceiling guys, in my opinion. Especially Chris Cole. And I know, Ryan, I get it. I know I'm biased. He's a Virginia kid. I get it. But he's also very long, very athletic, and gives me a lot of Jeremiah Wusu-Koramoah vibes. He really does. We'll watch a little bit of film of him while you're talking about it.
And I love Chris Cole, man. The minute he offered him, I was like, okay, this one I like. I think we talked about it on a recruiting show, right? He's a 6'3", 210-pound player who plays out in space a ton. Like, he's an overhang for them. He plays the rover position that Notre Dame plays. But he's got a body, Brian, where I'm like, yeah, he might play rover, but he might be a weak side linebacker eventually, man. Like, he's got length, athleticism. This kid's a playmaker on the second level, out in space. I like Chris Cole a lot, man. I really do like him. He would completely change. If you get Kingston and Chris Cole and then one or the other, I completely agree with you 100%. My opinion would completely change the linebacker recruiting, because I could care less what this kid's ranking are, because it's not.
I don't even know where he's ranked. I literally have not even looked at where he's
by
ranked.
most people.
Seriously?
I don't even know if he's a 4-star. I think he's a 3-star, consensus 3-star.
That tells you how much I like this film, right? I didn't even look at his ranking. I don't even care what people rank him as. Don't even care.
Brian, he's playing mid-hole safety right there, man. And he comes out and breaks up a pass on this play.
Look at that.
He is talented.
His length is insane. And he's the perfect body type for a modern rover, because he can run with wheel routes. He can he can cover a lot of ground. He's a baller, man. And he's the epitome of, I don't really care what people say about rankings. This is a kid who just, like, if you watch this kid and you think that he's a 3-star, I just don't know I don't think we evaluate football the same way. I just don't.
And here he is up on the line of scrimmage playing against tight ends. Like, he's a tight end eraser, I think, at the next level too. Like, you put this kid over tight ends, let him play some man, let him set edges. Like, this is a really good football player. A
Penn
true
State
rover.
Penn State wants him. Georgia's offered him. Florida's offered him. And this is a kid in Northwest Virginia. Okay, this is a dude. That's a dude for me.
This is a multi-level player for me that can, when you're playing against bigger personnel, if he's at rover, he comes play Sam linebacker and you're good to go. Right? You don't need to substitute anybody. Like, you're good, man. A guy that can play on the line of scrimmage, he can play stacked, he can play in space. I love Chris Cole, man. He's a player that I think Notre Dame really needs to make a big push for this week. I really
he's on
think
campus
so.
Friday, correct, Ryan?
Yes, Friday. Yes. Yep.
Okay. Is he going somewhere else on Saturday? Is that why he won't be at the Blue Gold game?
I'll check in on that. I'm not 100% sure on that one.
I'm curious if it's that or if he's making kind of a 2-day visit. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Brian Huff? I know he's going to be on campus this week. So Brian Huff's situation is interesting. So, of course, he sets his official visit dates while you're on campus. So I had to get back into my covering recruiting days. But did confirm with Brian that he not only is visiting this weekend, but he's already got an official visit set to Notre Dame. So Notre Dame is not his leader right now. I mean, I wouldn't project that they're going to get him right now. But when he's got 2 visits already set up and he hasn't been once, that tells you he's got some interest. Now, he's different than Chris Cole because he's an inside linebacker to me.
Yes,
he's a eventual Mike kind of guy. And he's a kid that has got some projection. He's got some tools to work with. He's a lower floor guy, but I like the ceiling quite a bit. So Brian Cole, Chris Cole, Kingston and Chris Cole are my 2 top guys, and Brian Huff is right there with those guys is that next group of guys that I think Notre Dame has a good shot with it. And I'll be honest about something. I like Peyton Pierce quite a bit. I like him more than you do, I think. But all 3 of these kids have much higher ceilings than Peyton Pierce. I like Peyton Pierce because I think he has an incredibly high floor because he's smart, he's instinctive and all that. But these guys, to me, have much higher ceilings, I think, than what Peyton Pierce had, who I like.
Well, I like Brian Huff because a lot of the same things we said about Chris Cole are true here in the sense that this kid is long, man. He's long and he's extremely projectable. He's listed at 6'3", 220. I mean, Brian, if he's 220 right there, man, he's going to be 245 easy. Like, it's not even going to be difficult to be 245 pounds. I think that this kid can play a little will, but I think that he is a Mike potentially at the next level down the line because I think that his body is just going to grow quick. Like, I think this kid is going to be a 6'2.5", 6'3", 245-pound downhill kid who can run a little bit as well. So I like him a ton. I wouldn't even be shocked if Notre Dame landed him if he's on a Viper eventually. Like, I wouldn't be totally shocked about that. He's got that length on the edge kind of frame, and the physicality. Yep. So I like him a lot, man. I think that he can really move, but he's much more downhill explosiveness than like rangy outside the tackle type of dude, right? Like, he's not that kid. But I think that he has enough as a will to be that guy that can have a little bit of range from the inside.
Yeah. Now, the reason that I have Chris Cole ahead of Brian Huff right now is because of what you just said. Yep. He's an inside guy. I'm looking at Chris Cole as sort of like completing that perfect linebacker class, with because if they're going to get Bodie Cahoon, and I like where Notre Dame is at right now. And again, I like Bodie Cahoon. You know this, Ryan. I have him ahead of Cole Sullivan on my board, but he's getting recruited by Tennessee. I mean, he's a good football player. I like Bodie Cahoon. My thing is, you don't take Bodie and Cole Sullivan. But if you get Bodie Cahoon and Kingston Sullivan, and then all of a sudden Chris Cole, you've got yourself a 3-man linebacking class can be on the field together, and that's important. So even though here's the concern, Ryan, and this is where I'm at, and this is why this weekend is so important. With defensive line, it's kind of like if you just give me one of these 6 Vipers you have on the board, and get me one of these 5 big ends you have on the board. I'm pretty good. I'm set. I'm good. Like, could it be better? Sure. Do I want to get better? Yes, absolutely. It's not there yet, but it's a pretty darn good class, especially if you get Justin Scott. It's a gap closing class. You give me the Smith twins, Owen Wafel, Justin Scott, and either Bryce Young or TJ Lindsey or Benedict Ume, and all of a sudden I'm like, yeah, that's a gap closing class right there. Now, maybe there aren't 4 gap closing D linemen, but as a defensive line, it's a gap closing class because it's definitely better than where you've been, right? Linebacker, it's more of you got to hit the inside straight here, right? Yes. And that's the concern. You've got to because the numbers aren't as big of guys that like you, and it's just one of those things where you got to strike it. You've got to. This next 2 weeks is going to be huge because if you don't make a big move on Chris Cole and Brian Huff and Kingston Viliama-Asa over the next week or two, you could be sitting in a situation where that linebacker class becomes really shaky, and it starts looking like a Charlie Weiss linebacker class, if we're being completely honest about it. I mean, that's what it starts to look like. So this next week for linebacker recruiting is going to be huge because as much as I'm down on linebacker recruiting, just not feeling good, it's the position I'm the most concerned about on the entire team right now when it comes to recruiting. Which is crazy when you consider where they've been the last couple of years, but it's the one I'm most concerned about. But there's still that opportunity there where if you do hit the inside straight, all of a sudden I'm like, okay, they're good. They're good. Yes. I feel really good about that. And that's kind of how, and I'm going to pull up some Bodie Cahoon highlights as we wrap this thing up, just to kind of show him as well.
You know what's funny, Brian, is that we're talking about 2 Arkansas guys today, man. We're talking about TJ Lindsey. Now we're talking about Brian Huff. When was the last time Notre Dame would have signed 2 guys?
Here's an interesting thing. They just named, they're going to, I don't think it's been officially announced yet, but they're about to name Butler Benton as their director of player personnel. Yes, you know where he came from? Arkansas.
Yep.
So can't hurt.
Well, Arkansas flavor, man. I love it. I love it.
Yeah. This is some Bodie Cahoon stuff. But, look, this is the thing for me, Ryan, is you're going to have to hit the inside straight. But like you give me Bodie Cahoon, I mean, you see it, right? He's a good athlete. He's a good football player. You give me Bodie Cahoon, Kingston Viliama-Asa, and Chris Cole or Brian Huff, and I'm like, all right, we're set, man. We're set. Yeah. I feel really good about linebacker at that point in time. Really good about linebacker, especially when you look at, combining them with last year's class. So there is the opportunity there for this linebacker class to be really good. It just, I don't feel as good about them actually finishing with those guys. Does that make sense? I mean,
it does.
Is that fair? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, you're a little bit keyed into these kids' recruitments than I am, but I mean, I think that's a fair thing to say.
It is. I mean, because you're talking about the guys that you're quantifying as guys that Notre Dame needs to make a big push for, right? Like, let's start with Kingston. Kingston is a player that he likes Notre Dame. It's obvious, right? Notre Dame is really high on him, but he was scheduled to come on a visit a few weeks ago. He ends up not making that visit, and you need to get him back on campus to have a legitimate chance here, right? To continue to push and to hopefully take over that recruitment. Like, that's a reality. And until he gets back on campus, you can't say you feel great about it. Like, you feel okay about it, but you can't say you feel great. I mean, we're just talking about Chris Cole as being a guy, right, Brian? Chris Cole was offered by the staff like less than 2 months ago. Like, it's not like they've been on him very long. I mean, Brian Huff's another guy that's only been on the board for a couple months. Like, we're talking about guys that Notre Dame has not been on long outside of Kingston as the potential must-gets almost to a degree, right? Like,
deal,
so it's
Ryan.
nervous.
Where they are right now is exactly where they were with Chris Cole and Brian Huff. Is exactly where they were with Jalen Sneed 2 years ago.
Sure.
I was sitting here in April. I was like, they're not going to get Jalen Sneed. I mean, that's good that they offered him. He's a stud, but they're not going to get that kid. You know, and you had just kind of flipped Josh Burnham from Michigan. Well, I flipped him. I mean, that's they didn't flip him. Josh Burnham never actually committed to Michigan, but like there was always just everybody assumed it. That's where he was going to go. I mean, you know, grew up a Michigan fan and all that. You know, you just got him in March. And you're like, okay, well, that was big, but like, who else are you going to get? You felt good about getting Junior Tuihalamaka eventually, but Jalen Sneed was not a guy on my radar. I mean, I liked him, and I thought he was a heck of a player, but he was not a guy any of us thought Notre Dame was going to sign. Is my point. And so, you know, a year ago, was everybody locked in? There's no doubt Jaden Greathouse is going to sign with Notre Dame last year. It wasn't until the blue gold game. Well, and remember this, Sullivan Absher came into the blue gold game with everybody thinking he was going to go to Clemson or NC State. Yes. Comes out of the blue gold game, committed to Notre Dame. So that's what this weekend can be. And I mean, I've been told there's going to be 300-400 former players at this event this year again. And like all the big name guys are coming. Like, it's going to be a huge event. So this is a big weekend for Notre Dame, and at linebacker, it's going to be huge. This is going to be your make or break week. I'm not saying you got to land kids and get commitments from all these guys, but you've got to make a move to where you feel like, hey, we're in a good position to say, hey, we can just battle. Look, yeah, we're second or third with all these kids, but let's work to get first. We don't need to go expand the board and offer 40 more kids and do all that. Just these are the guys on our board. Go get me 3 of them, or even if you just get 2 of them. If one of them's Kingston, I'm good. But that's going to be the key for Notre Dame, right? They've got to hit a grand slam home run at linebacker this weekend. Absolutely.
Because I think too, Brian, and you know, we haven't talked about this much, but we know Notre Dame linebacker play in 2022 wasn't good enough, right? Like, we know that it wasn't stellar. I think seeing it in person, hopefully at an improved level, seeing guys like Nolan Ziegler running around, Jalen Sneed, and all those guys, right? Them assimilating into it, Drake Bowen playing ball. Like, that would be big for some of these guys. It's like, oh, no, they have some guys, man. Yeah. Like, maybe that's on the come up.
Blitz. if they still do that this weekend, because they've been blitzing a lot this spring. I mean, I feel like Al Golden watched. Remember the Titans the day before spring ball started. You know, and he's watching Coach
Yost.
Coach Yost blitz all night, you know, and that's just Al Golden.
Not another yard.
That's been Al Golden this spring, you know what I mean? Notre Dame's version of Coach Yost. So it's a big weekend. Let's move over to safety recruiting, Ryan. I'm sorry, what are you going to say?
Oh, no, I was just going to say that was the most ridiculous speech of all time. He's like, if you gain another yard, I'm taking all of you out. I'm like, who doesn't give up a yard?
Yeah.
Like, okay.
But they didn't. In the movie, they didn't. So let's move over to safety, Ryan, because this is every bit as important as defensive line recruiting in this class. Don't feel as good about where the board is now as I did a month ago. And that mainly comes down to a month ago, I felt really good about their chances of getting Jalen McClain. And I don't feel as good about that now. I don't know that there's a lot they could have done. Once I saw that he was going to Oregon on a visit, I got nervous because a kid from Jersey, a private school in Jersey, taking a trip to Oregon is not ideal news. And the fact that he kept telling you, I'm going to visit, but never did. Yeah. And now we're getting to the the blue gold game, and as far as I know, he still hasn't set up a visit. That makes me kind of feeling like, okay, I don't think this one, I don't feel very good about this one to where I used to. And that's disappointing because he is an absolute dude. And as I've kind of done some digging on this, it does seem like the NIL stuff is going to be a lot more important to him now than what I thought it was going to be a while ago. So hopefully they can kind of get things back on track. But the fact that he has yet to schedule, I mean, he's been to Ohio State this spring. He's been to Penn State this spring. I think he was just to Penn State this past weekend. I believe he's either gone to Oregon or he's going to go to Oregon.
He's been to Oregon already.
So, but he hasn't made it over to Notre Dame. Actions speak louder than words, and so I'm not feeling great about that one anymore, Ryan.
Yeah. I mean, this is like covering recruiting. This is, again, actions speak louder than words, right? It's like, I've talked to recruits in the past that are just like, yeah, I'm definitely going to get there, and then you just keep asking. They just never do it, right? And like that's kind of where we are with Jalen. I mean, to your point, Brian, it's like if he decides to visit Notre Dame over the next couple of weeks, then you start feeling a little bit better about it. But I mean, until it happens, it's words, right? So that's kind of where you are, is that you need to see the action, and the action hasn't happened yet.
And I don't know. I mean, look, I have no problem criticizing the staff if they're not getting the job done. Yeah. In this particular one, I don't know what like I've been very critical of Al Washington's recruiting, but I don't blame him for Keon Keeley. I don't know that there could have been anything different that they could have done.
Yep.
So now it's about, okay, well, he's not out, but now the good news is that DeJuan Lane is now more interested in Notre Dame than he was before. There's a lot of work to be done there. But DeJuan Lane's a guy that I like a lot, Ryan. Is kind of like that alley safety, maybe a potential rover, but I really like him as sort of like a really rangy alley safety. He's from Baltimore Gilman. If they're able to somehow kind of get him to be a little bit more interested, now all of a sudden I feel a lot better about Notre Dame's chances at really landing an impact safety. Because, I mean, we'll talk about like Davis Andrews and guys like that who I like a lot, but Davis Andrews to me is if he's got to be your second best safety in the class.
Yeah.
Not your number one. And I'm a lot higher on Davis Andrews than most. You need a Jalen McClain. You need a DeJuan Lane. And the other thing I think that I like about the potential of the safety class, and this is something that Jalen McClain didn't add, but DeJuan Lane did, is they're not a really big safety group. They're small. Sure. And they are looking at some potential bigger guys in this class. And we'll get to Dave. We'll watch some film of Davis Andrews, and here I'm going to watch a little bit from DeJuan Lane. But if they can get some traction with DeJuan Lane here soon, that would be very important for Notre Dame.
Yeah, I mean, he's that 6'2" long safety, right? That
he's actually checked in places at 6'3", so he's he's maybe even grown a little bit. I mean, he's a kid that's going to be a legit 210-ish somewhere like that strong safety type. I mean, he is a physically imposing kid, but he's pretty flexible for his size, man. Like he can change direction pretty well for his size. His technique is a bit of a mess. It's like I'll be honest. When I first watched this film, I was like, okay, I see some things I really like, but there were some things like that post route, a corner route. He looked a little tight, and then you watch his footwork. His footwork's a mess. But when he's playing receiver and returning kicks, you can see that elusiveness. You can see, okay, that guy's got a little something. But he's a guy that you got coming downhill. He's a guy that you got when you're playing cover one. He's the guy coming down, not the guy going deep. He's the guy that you match up against tight ends. He's the guy that you match up against backs, and he's the guy that tells receivers, you may not want to come over here. You know what I mean? Like this may not be a zone you want to get into. And so he's a guy too, Ryan, that I look at and say, look, right now they've got a lot of ground to make up. That right there, that speed right there, that's where you're like, okay, that guy can run. Yeah. But a lot of ground to make up here. I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. They're not in that top 2 or 3 right now for him, but they're working, and he's listening more and talking more and engaging more. But he's just a guy that you gotta try to get on campus. So he's just got easy speed right here, Ryan. That's the thing that you see. He runs easy.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for Notre Dame to make that impact in Maryland, right?
Yes, the DC Catholic school and private school area, man. Like, yes, it's absolutely needed. This is against Calvert Hall, I believe. school that I recruited in the back in the day. So anyway, I think that's a kid that I really like a lot, Ryan. He's a guy on the board. There's another safety that's going to be on campus this weekend. Actually, let's talk about the guy that was on campus this past week, and that's Kennedy Urlacher. Obviously, he's a guy that staff is very high on. He's another kid, not ranked real high, good football player, but he's more about ceiling right now. He's just a raw athlete that doesn't necessarily, he needs a lot of technical work, but you're betting on the DNA there. That's really what you're betting on when it comes to Kennedy Urlacher. I like him. I mean, he's not a top 150 guy. I have him like around that 250 range, but I have him as a 4-star player right now. I think he runs really well. I think he's a thumper. He's instinctive. But I have him as like a 250-ish kind of range, 230 to 275 type of range right now with a higher ceiling. That's kind of how I view Kennedy right now.
He is a downhill striker, man. Like that's the first thing that pops off on Kennedy for me and why I've talked about him. Like eventually, maybe he's a rover. At like 6'1". Right now, he's listed at like 6'1", 180. But I mean, he's probably more close to the 6 foot range and probably going to be 200 pounds pretty quickly, right? Like he's got kind of that frame to him. But that kid he's energetic, I think is the best way to put it, man. Like he comes downhill with some incredibly bad intentions, really nice downhill explosive athlete, but man, he comes with bad. He's a really, because we've had him on the podcast. He's a really soft-spoken kid, very nice, non-assuming, very modest. But then you watch him and you're like, oh, his game's not modest though. Like he's physical, he's imposing.
Off the field is nothing like how he carries himself on the field.
No,
you nailed that one. You nailed that one spot on, Ryan. Absolutely nailed that one spot on.
Yeah, he's not a nice person on the field. He's not a nice person.
Here's a guy that I think is one of the most underrated players in the class. This is Davis Andrews from Utah. If he was not from Utah, I think he's a top 200 player, like easily. I think I graded him out as a top 150 kid. That's how I graded him out. Absolutely love this kid. I think he's athletic. I think he is fast. I think he can hit. I think he needs work on his technique, but I think he's a kid that's got a ton of tools, and he's a ball hawk. This kid is around the football a ton. This is one of my favorite. This is the kind of kid that in the past goes to Utah, and nobody has any clue who he is. And all of a sudden, you're like, how did this kid become a 3-time all Pac-12 player? You know what I mean? On this Utah team.
Like Chase Hansen or something like that. Yeah.
And that's who he is to me. I mean, he exactly who he is to me. This is a really good football player, Ryan, a really good football player.
And he's one of those big safeties you talked about. He's 6'2", 195 pounds. He's got a big frame. He could also be a rover eventually.
Yeah,
he has that type of profile.
Now, I've done some digging onto this, Ryan, and from the thing I've been told is they're recruiting him as a pure safety. Having said that, he can be a pure safety that also can play as part of a 3-safety defense where you're trying to match up where he's playing where the rover plays, but he's just a little different than the rover because he's not like the same linebacker type of thing. But you're trying to match up and put some better athletes on the field. In that regard, I could see it. I could certainly see it.
That's like how when Gary Patterson was at his heyday playing the 4-2-5, they used to play a lot of umbrella coverage, right? And he was that would be him. Like he'd be one of those underneath safeties in like an umbrella type of look. Like Brian, I mean, honestly, I'll call it like it is, man. I think that there's some people that don't think he's a good athlete, which I disagree with because he's a white safety. I think that we get that a little bit from Utah. Right. Yeah. But I think you see him and you're like, change his direction well. 6'2", 195. He's got some length, pretty good straight line speed. Like he's a good athlete, man. And he's a big physical kid, but also I think he has a really good understanding of spacing. Like he just always seems to be in the right spot. And like that's something that you can't quantify as well. But it shows up on the film. It's like, why are you in that spot, Davis? Because I saw the game at a high level, right? Like you see the game, and that matters.
But he's the thing. But like you said, he's athletic. That's the thing. He's athletic, and that's what I like. So that's kind of. I mean, that's the top. DeJuan Lane's top of the board. Davis Andrews is the top of the board. Kennedy Urlacher is the top of the board. After that, they like Marquise Gallegos. He's a guy that was on campus recently. I think things went well, not great. They went well. Michigan's also making a run at him. Paul Menke was on campus recently. That's still an early new recruitment, Ryan. They just offered him within the last month. He did visit. That's a growing relationship between the two. They're still kind of getting to know each other. Like they offered him recently. Like they don't know him as well as some of the other guys. the film they like. So I think that's kind of a budding relationship. We'll kind of see how that goes. Oliver Miles is going to be on campus this week. People have asked us about him. He's a good football player. My only concern with Oliver Miles is I just don't know that he runs the way that I would hope that you'd be getting, in my opinion. You know what I mean? Like,
I think
good athlete.
I think he's more short burst guy than straight line speed guy. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah, and to me, Ryan, he's a guy that you'd hope he'd grow into a rover the way he plays.
Agree.
But I don't know if he has the body for that.
He's a high school quarterback, and he actually has an interesting track background. He's like a 48-foot triple jumper, 23-foot long jumper. Like, he's got that explosiveness, but he's not long. Like, long speed.
Yes, that's it. He's got some explosiveness in that regard that I think will come out of him. Where, again, I could see like a Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah type of athlete down the road, where that short area burst is really good. The change of direction is really good, but the speed isn't. Like, I've said this, people, nobody wants to believe me. Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah purposely did not run the 40 because for 2 years I kept being told by people at Notre Dame he's not going to very fast in the 40. He's like a 4.7 guy in the 40. Like, and that's why no one ever expected him to run the pro day ever. And so he had a hamstring. You can do all the jumps and leaps and drills with a hamstring, but you can't run a 40-yard dash. No, that's a reason why, because he's explosive. He's just not long speed fast, right? And from 1 to 20, Jeremiah Owusu can run as well as anybody. Yeah, it's the 40-50 that, but that's kind of how I see this kid athletically, more so than that guy you want covering a ton of ground as an alley safety or a center fielder now. That's just kind of where I see him at this point in time, Ryan. I don't know if you agree with that or not. He's got some tools, but I think he would be more of a, if I miss here, I'm going here.
Sure.
A guy that right now is a bit of a long shot that I know the staff is very high on is Bronte Johnson. And that's just because of the things we've discussed in the past. I just don't know if that one's going to be able to happen. I know he likes Notre Dame and Notre Dame likes him. I just don't think that's going to kind of be where you're at. But this is another one, Ryan, where this weekend is going to be big for this because I like where Notre Dame is right now with Davis Andrews. I wouldn't say that they're his leader right now. I think that they're in the mix right now. Yeah. And I would say they're in his top group right now. But you've got to really knock it out of the park, in my opinion, this weekend, because he's been on some visit. I mean, he went to Tennessee recently. He went to UCLA recently. Obviously, Utah is going to be in the mix, but he's a guy that, to me, Notre Dame has got to make a move for this weekend.
I think they can. I think they can because Davis has talked to me in the past that his family has an affinity for Notre Dame growing up, right? Mm-hmm. Like, they do have kind of a little bit of a fandom, which doesn't always mean that you end up with that school, right? Like, that's not what that means. But it does say that, like, he understands Notre Dame, I think, is what I'm trying to say here, right? Like, he knows the brands. He grew up with the brands. He knows about Notre Dame football. So getting on campus, he's actually been on campus once before, but it was more for like a camp, I think, or something like that last year. He's never been on campus, obviously, for like a more of a game day feel, game day environment, like that type of deal, right? So getting on campus for that type of situation, I think is going to be big for Davis, especially because his family does like Notre Dame. Like they do. Like, there's no doubt about that one.
Just got to impress him this weekend. That's the big key because that's a good football player right there, man.
American Fork too, man. It's good football out in Utah. I know there's not a ton of it, but that's a good school.
It is. So we'll kind of see how that one plays out, Ryan. But I think this weekend is going to be very important for that. Getting him on campus and really showing him what your program is all about. And that's true for a lot of these kids that are on campus, Ryan. And I know you'll have a preview of the weekend's visitors at irishbreakdown.com. You're coming up this weekend, but look, this is going to be and this was true last year as well. Like, you really needed to make a move last year with your spring game stuff, and they did. And there's guys that went into the spring game where we felt Notre Dame was going to get them and close. I mean, by the time we got to the blue gold game, we felt pretty good about where they were with for example, Jaden Greathouse, right? We felt good about where they were there. And, there's other guys that, you had your shot to make a move with Caleb Downs. You didn't do it. They had a bad visit with Monroe Freeling. And I believe, that was in the summer. The summers, they had a great visit with Monroe Freeling. You lost that momentum. But they were able to close on some guys last spring and really get in a great position. Jaden Lamar came, and by the time the visit was over, we thought he was actually going to commit that weekend. He ended up deciding to wait till later. We kind of know what happened there, but it's an important weekend, and I think there's even more guys on the board this spring that you have to close on than last spring. What's interesting is if Kingston makes it this weekend, this will be the second year in a row he's on campus for Notre Dame's Blue Gold game.
Yeah, he was last year with Peyton Woodyard last year.
Yeah, that's right. Yep, they both came last weekend. So great opportunity for Notre Dame to close. Great opportunity for Notre Dame to close. And they just got to do it. And then in other positions, okay, it's time for you to put yourself in the game with Chris Cole. Put yourself in the game with Brian Huff. Put yourself in the game with some of these other guys, and then close on the guys that you are in a great position with. That's going to be the key for the staff this weekend. And that's what I'm looking forward to, Ryan. So that's going to do it for this portion of the show, Ryan, but we're going to go to the mailbag next. But before we do, folks, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. And if you have not done so, please sign up for the CFP Nation podcast app. Definitely do that. And as always, sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. We had some intel last night, some spring game and some spring ball intel, Ryan. It's a little nuggets there, about 6 or 7 little nuggets there that we had last night. So if you're a member, you saw it. If you're a member that hasn't been on today or wasn't on late last night, go check that out. And if you're not a member, it's a good reason to sign up because I think the intel is going to be pretty good. We hope to have some recruiting intel this week too, now that my recruiting guy is no longer on vacation. So we'll get that rocking for you as well at boards.irishbreakdown.com. So Ryan, we got some mailbags here, mailbag questions here. So if you want to get those in, we're going to go till about 4:30. So get those questions. You still got to schedule, Ryan, so forth. Okay. So we start off with a little super chat from K Grant, Brian without a hat and rocking my favorite shirts. Yeah. I mean, look, man, there's no better time to do this than now, right? Got the Gap Closer shirt, which you can get actually, if it's your favorite shirt, K Grant, then you need to have bought it off of the IB store, which you can find the link to in the description box below. Ryan, also, you can find that hat. I got all types of hats over here that you get. And I actually put a new one in there, Ryan. There's a new IB hat. I don't know if it's one that you're going to want. I'm going to buy it here soon. But it's, those distressed looks, those ones where looks like those older hats. I love those hats. And so they finally offered one. I got one in there as well that I got to go buy. I absolutely love those. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for the super chat.
I know people are freaking out that you weren't wearing a hat today. So
I know. I didn't wear one this weekend either on the video that I did about Caleb Smith. Lots happened since you've been gone, Ryan, with the Notre Dame team. So lots going on. There's no doubt. Here's a question, Ryan, and we'll get back. You can I'll read these, and then you can answer most of these, and we'll just kind of go from there, Ryan. But David Lowe asks, who do y'all think our next commitment will be?
Well, David, someone asked this on the message board or asked more like a timeline for commitments. I think that Notre Dame has a chance to really close on a couple guys potentially this weekend, right? So I think for me, the question is more, when is it going to happen? I think that the month of May, you're going to see a couple guys come off the board for Notre Dame, right? I think that for me, ask me who Notre Dame's in a good position with, right? That's a better question. I think it starts for me with Kennedy or Lacker. Notre Dame's in a good position there. You have Kennedy or Lacker. You're in a good spot there. Bodie Cahoon is a guy that's going to be on campus for the second time in a couple weeks. You feel good about where they are with him. The Smith twins, you're in a solid spot, but it's kind of trying to close on them. But if you're asking me who is Notre Dame in the best spot with right now that I think is the most conceivable that they will make a decision sometime soon, I think Kennedy Urlacher is a guy that you should definitely be keeping an eye on. I think Bodie Cahoon is a guy that you're going to keep a good eye on because there's a reason that he's back for the second time in 3 weeks, right? There's a reason for that. There's obviously legitimate interest there. So those are a couple of guys that I think Notre Dame is in very good spot with, but I'm not going to predict who's the next guy to commit, but those are guys that I think Notre Dame's in a good spot with right now.
Ryan, I don't necessarily want to say who, but there's a couple guys on offense that I could see popping soon as well. So we'll have to see kind of how things close, but there's a couple guys. Actually, there's 3 or 4 guys on offense I could see over the next few weeks Notre Dame closing on, but we're going to keep those names off the board right now. But yeah, yep. All right. So am I still popping, everybody? Is it still happening when I'm talking? Ryan, can you hear me when I'm talking? Is it popping?
You sound fine to me right now.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So let me know, folks, if it's still happening when I'm talking. All right.
Someone said, let's blame Vince.
Yeah, totally.
That's funny.
Okay, so let's get to some more questions here, Ryan. Here's one from Seth Clark. What is your feeling on Notre Dame and Coach Rudolph's interest in Styles Prescott?
It's an interesting one, Seth. I think the offensive line recruiting is just in general very interesting right now because you talk about, Coach Rudolph comes in and he instantly has some ties at Virginia Tech from his recruiting that you see instantly kind of pop up, right? Like we talk about Anthony Knapp and obviously his commitment to Notre Dame.
Who, by the way, just got ranked as a top 200 player by On3.
Yeah,
now
again, I like him, man. I like him.
I do. I've come around on him a little bit. I still, it's not that. The thing is, here's what's frustrating about Anthony Knapp's situation is he's forever going to be tied to Caleb Brewer.
Yeah,
and it's kind of like I like Anthony Knapp. I do. I've come around on him, especially when I found out he had 34-inch arms. He's athletic. He's got some strength and all that. But it's like, but I don't love the idea of like passing on Caleb Brewer. That's the issue that I had more so than taking Anthony. I have no problem taking Anthony Knapp. I just, why take Anthony Knapp and pass on Caleb Brewer? That was the thing that was a little bit like
very frustrating.
Just a bit of a head scratcher for me.
Very frustrating. Yeah, the whole Caleb Brewer thing was something that I am always going to be a little bit frustrated with. But here we are. In a vacuum, I like Anthony Knapp. But then, like even Aiden Lynch didn't get an offer this past weekend, right? But Aiden Lynch gets brought on for a visit. He's another kid that interesting tools, but not a guy that I would push for personally. But he's a guy that Coach Rudolph also had on campus this weekend, right? Like obviously and he is a guy that Coach Rudolph had offered at Virginia Tech. So there's a couple reshuffling of the board a little bit, but so like if you ask me right now, what are the certainties that I know on the offensive line recruiting board, Brian? I would say Notre Dame is still very high on Gerby Lambert. That's one for sure. They were not high on Caleb Brewer, at least from the Rudolph perspective.
Sprague.
Or Andrew Sprague. Those are the guys that you're just like, those are the certainties that we know.
And I agree with the Sprague one. Ryan, you know this. I was never super high on Andrew Sprague. I'm fine with them not pushing for it. There's a reason Harry Heastand didn't offer him. And and there's a reason that when Joe Rudolph came, he wasn't overly enamored with him either, to be honest with you. And there were some people in the recruiting office I think that, like the size and the potential, and I get that. And they wanted to get on the board so that way the next O-line coach could come in and evaluate them and see what they thought. I don't think that anybody was necessarily in love with them. But the Caleb Brewer one is it. But Gerby Lambert's definitely one, and Styles Prescott is another that I do think the staff is high on at this point in time.
Yeah, Styles. And then, there's like that little mix of some offensive tackles on the board, right? Like Kevin Haywood was on a visit pretty recently, a couple weekends ago. You talk about Styles. To the question, Seth, I think that they like Styles Prescott. Styles was just on campus recently, right? Like, that's just another one where it's like he's an Indiana kid. He's been on to a couple trips on campus now. He's offered. When do you pop type of thing, right? And is it going to be Notre Dame? Because I think that there is definitely a liking to Styles Prescott. I just need to find a little bit more information on, I guess, what Coach Rudolph wants to do here, right? Like that's kind of what I'm looking at is like I'm just kind of sitting back and just saying like I'm just evaluating Coach Rudolph's moves here, right? And as far as like what his affinity for certain players are. And if there's any shift at all, other than obviously Knapp and taking a longer look at Aiden Lynch type of thing. Like, it's just going to be interesting to see.
Yeah. Let's get to the next question here, Mr. Roberts. See, I'm going to actually want to comment on this one from John. It says, it's weird, but I'm not feeling the same vibe in recruiting this year as I did last year. There doesn't seem to be any energy. Honestly, I think that says more about the fan base than it does where Notre Dame's recruiting is right now. I think just in general in this country, I just think over the last year, there's just been so much negative. People just always focusing on the negatives. And I think to a somewhat understandable degree, there's far more fans that just tend to focus on the negative, losing Keon, losing Bowen, and not enough on the fact that like everybody in the chase to constantly bitch about, quarterback. And now it's like we don't even talk about their 5-star quarterback anymore. You know what I mean? And it's just like, guys, Notre Dame is in a really good place. They're one of 3 teams the last 2 years to have to be in the top 5 in blue chip rating in the last 2 years, along with Alabama and Ohio State. That is it. They've got a top 5 class right now. They flat out do. They had a great recruiting class last year, even with all the guys they lost. You're already seeing this recruiting class make an impact in pads at Notre Dame. You're already seeing it. And this class is out. You got one of the best receivers in the country. You've got one of the best quarterbacks in the country. You got a 4-star running back that nobody talks about. You've got 2 4-star offensive linemen, and you've got a top 250, in my view, defensive tackle and a top 150 cornerback who is not just ranked top 150 by me, but by somebody else. You're leading for a 5-star defensive tackle. You've got a really good chance to land a borderline top 50 offensive tackle. You've got some really talented receivers on the board that you've got a really good shot with, and you're at the point now where I'm actually debating and arguing that Notre Dame should turn down a couple of top 100 tight ends because I'd like to see them use a scholarship next year because they're also in great position with 2 stud tight ends next year that I would rather have take 2 next year in James Flanagan and Nate Roberts, right? Linebacker recruiting is a concern. Safety recruiting is a concern. There's no doubt about that. But there's just been this sense of negativity where it's like people only want to concentrate and complain about the misses and not focus on the wins. And I think that's more of an us problem and a fan problem than it is a Notre Dame problem. That doesn't mean everything is perfect with Notre Dame's recruiting. It's not. They've got to get better at some certain positions. There's no question. But I feel like we've got this thing where if it's not Georgia, it sucks. And I can't stand that, to be honest with you, because we end up like there's so many good football players that Notre Dame is recruiting right now that aren't elite, but they're good that I just hear nothing but complaining about.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of getting tired of it, to be completely honest with you. But I mean, it's the nature of it. But I just think as a fan base, far too many of us are too just constantly obsessing. Not just it's fine to talk about the negatives when they're there. I'm fine with those. But it's the obsessing over it and the harping on it to where the only time I hear some people comment is if it's to complain. I put this really good intel piece out last night. It's got all these positive things, and then there's just people jumping, I'm really worried about the defense. It's like, what from this intel piece would make you worried about it? It doesn't mean you can't be, but why are you jumping into this intel piece complaining right now? And I think there's just too much of that, in my opinion. So, I think, John, that's it. I think you talk to people around the program, especially at certain positions, there's a lot of excitement right now. I think the lack of buzz says more about us as a fan base than it does about what Notre Dame's doing.
I think it's also this year. I mean, because I agree with you, Brian. It's like it's the fan perspective, right? But I think that it's also this year. I don't know if you agree with this, but this year more than the last couple, in my opinion, some of these rankings are awful, man. And people hyper focus on rankings. But these rankings this year are terrible, man. Like they're really bad. I mean, I remember, you remember when DeMello Jones was offered and he was a 0-star kid and everyone's like, oh, why are we offering a 0-star? And now he's a top 150.
And we kept trying to tell y'all, this is a dude. We kept trying to tell y'all. And then now who's he committed to? Georgia. And now everybody's putting him in their top 100, right?
Yes.
Like, it's like Peyton Pierce is a perfect example, right? I mean, he's a top 100 kid by some people. He's not a top 100 kid to me. And then the on-3 ranking for him is one of the most. It's even worse than Micah Bell's. I mean, and now I'm curious if they're going to change the ranking now that he's committed to Ohio State. I'm very curious to see if they're going to change that. But On3 right now has him ranked as the number 113 player in the state of Texas, whereas Rivals has him number 177 in the nation. ESPN has him 128, and 247 Sports has him 164. Yet On3 has him ranked as the number 113 player in the state of Texas. Right? Like these ranking, like the fact that CJ Carr is ranked as the number 193 player in the country is one of the stupidest things I have ever seen in my entire life.
It's really bad, man.
You're going to put Jaden Davis as a 5-star and Julian Sain as a top 20 player, and you're going to have CJ Carr in the 190s. You don't know what you're looking at. You have no clue what you're looking at this point in time. It's absurd. And I think you're right, Ryan. The rankings are getting worse and worse and worse.
It's really
24/7 Sports has never been the same since Barton Simmons left when it comes to rankings. It's not the same. He was a football guy. The people doing it now are not football guys. They're reporters that think they're football guys, right? Well, I think Rivals is trying. They're trying to bring in good people. They're trying. It's not great right now, but they're trying. They got rid of some bad folks that weren't good at it. They're trying to hire some people that have some football knowledge. They're trying. On3, I don't know what the freaking heck On3 is doing, but it is bad. And so it's like, and ESPN's is just so inconsistent, hit or miss. It's just like, what are you guys doing? The rankings are getting less and less reliable, in my opinion. And all the data people use about those, the percentage, that's from people that aren't there anymore doing that. But I think that's a great point, Ryan, is there's so many people obsessing over rankings that they're just not, and there's really nothing that we can tell them.
Yeah.
It's like, you can say, hey, like Keydron Young, for example, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to tell you about that kid when it comes to his ranking. I have no clue what to tell you. And I have no clue how people can look at him and not have him ranked high, as a top 100 kind of guy. But he is. And here's the thing, On3, who I just lambasted, they do have him as a top 100 guy. So they're schizophrenic. Like, that's the thing. Like,
Brian, do you remember? Do you remember when Leonard Moore committed and we had that one guy in the chat that was like, "Oh, Notre Dame's settling for a 3-star." It's like, it's not a 3-star, man.
Now
he's
look
not
at
a
him.
3-star.
Now he's a top 150 player in the country according to Rivals, and so it's just like On3 has Keydron Young as the number 81 player in the country and the number 8 running back, but yet ESPN doesn't have him in their top 300, and 247 Sports doesn't have him in their top 247, and Rivals has him. There are not 212 players better than Keydron Young in the country. So if you get him, it's like, and I had the same argument that I had with Logan Diggs. 3-star. I'm like, guys, I don't care what his rankings are. That's a freaking dude. And then look at him, right? I had the same argument with people when Benjamin Morrison first got offered and they were getting him. He was a 3-star kid when they committed to Notre Dame. Not a single soul in the recruiting industry from a national network standpoint had him as a top 300 player. And I kept telling guys, I'm telling you, they're wrong. Yeah. And so to me, that's just kind of where I'm at, right?
I also think the one thing that we also need to remember is that we're talking about juniors in high school that still have another season to play, right? Like, these aren't finished kids. They are finished products. Someone said this on the board earlier, Brian, and I responded to it, that said, I don't see any Brandon Hillman type safeties on this board. I'm just like, this time last year, Brandon Hillman was a 3-star recruit who only had Norfolk State as an offer.
This year, yes, 1,000%. And this year, this time a year ago, nobody knew who the freaking heck Brandon Hillman was.
Exactly. That's what I mean.
And when Chad Bowden first went after him and offered him, people are like, who the freaking heck is this kid? He's a 3-star kid. He's only got offers from such and such and such and such. And then by the time he leaves, it's like, oh my God, this is such a terrible loss. And it's just I'm like, you guys, when he committed, the same people mad about him leaving or him not getting in are the same people that were bitching about them taking him in the first place.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's the thing that kind of frustrates me is the rankings are unreliable, and I'm going to give you an honest assessment. And there's some kids that I'm not as high on that Ryan's higher on. And there's some kids I'm higher on that Ryan's not. And we'll be wrong. We're going to have misses, but I'm going to give you my honest opinion. And what I'm telling you is that you should be. Now, are there positions that you need to be a little nervous? Absolutely. And we just explained 3 of them to you today, right? They got to close, Ryan. They're not there yet because they haven't closed on these guys. And then you got to hold on to them. But there's a lot of guys on the board. And there's an opportunity for this to be another great class. And you know what else the staff is doing that I think is smart? They're really recruiting this class at the same time that they're recruiting next year's class. And I think that's smart. And the tight end one is a big one for me. And I know that this is an unpopular opinion. I'm not saying that – I want to make sure that I'm clear on something. I am not saying that Notre Dame has stopped recruiting Jaden Riddell and Carter Nelson. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that Brian Driscoll, my opinion is I don't think they should take another tight end in this class. My opinion. And here's why. Number one, go look at Jaden Riddell's sophomore film and compare it to Nate Roberts and James Flanagan's sophomore film. And you're going to, in my opinion, you're going to be like, he's not as good as those dudes as a sophomore. You're now comparing Jaden Riddell as a junior to those kids as sophomores at a time when you're seeing the biggest physical jumps for these young people as they go from freshman to sophomore to junior to seniors in high school, right? And so to me, but it's also about, I want to use that extra scholarship to maybe get a second back to get Keydron Young. Or, hey, we get the Smith twins, we get, you get Justin Scott, and you either get a Bryce Young or an Owen or a TJ Lindsay or a Benedict Dumaine. You got your 5-man class, right? But I still want to have room to bring it to still keep recruiting Elijah Rushing. I'd much rather do that than bring in a second tight end when Notre Dame is reshifting the numbers at tight end because the roster was getting too tight end heavy. well, they always get under 85. It's not the 85 you need to obsess over. It's the fact that I can't give enough scholarships to safeties or linebackers or DNs because I have too many guys at safety or tight end. You know what I mean? And that's the reality of it. And so to me, it's not that Jaden Riddell's not a heck of a football player. He is. It's just they're fine at tight end. They're great at tight end, in fact. And it's a loaded 2025 class, and they need to smartly evaluate the numbers and where the emphasis is this year and say, I would rather save those a couple extra scholarships because here's why. The Notre Dame coaching staff and me, I agree with them here. They think this team is going to be really freaking good in 2023. If you believe that, there comes a point in time where you got to bet on yourself and say, I think if we go out and have the year that we're capable of, we may be able to flip Ryan Wingo down the line as our fourth receiver, even though we don't necessarily have room for it. We may be able to flip or get Elijah Rushing down the stretch if we're as good as we think that we're going to be. That may be what we need to do to get Caleb Beasley in the class, where we don't need a third corner. And to me, those positions are all more important than a second tight end, in my opinion, in this class. And so that's kind of where I'm at. And I think this staff is doing that, Ryan. I think that they're smartly recruiting 25 because it may say, hey, look, we don't need to reach on this kid because we're in a really good place with kids next year. And I think that's something that's going to be interesting how that factors into some of these positions like linebacker and safety to say, hey, look, I don't want to reach here and give a scholarship to a 4-year kid that may not be good enough. We can just go in the portal next year and get a 1-year stopover for numbers, because we're really in a great position with the 25 kids. And if this team is going to be as good as they think they're going to be, it's going to have an even bigger impact on the 25 class. So I just think there's a lot more that goes into this than just load up and figure it out later. That's not really practical. That sounds great on a message board or in a show for people like us to say. But as a football coach, Ryan, that's not really and I could do that at D3. I could just because we could bring in 250 kids if we wanted to. Yeah. But you can't do that here. There's a proper roster management that you need to focus on. And I think that's something that people need to consider too. And because we're getting a lot of comments about Jaden Riddell and Carter Nelson, and it has nothing to do with them not being excellent players. They are. It's just if there's one position that Notre Dame can afford to say, we'll push it off to next year, it's freaking tight end. Because here's the thing, right? If somebody gets hurt or somebody transfers, you've known some really good tight ends that you've worked with in the draft. You're telling me, say, for example, last offseason, if Notre Dame, let's say Michael Mayer got hurt in the offseason and Notre Dame needed a tight end, that some of those kids, like that kid from South Dakota State who's about to get drafted, wouldn't have been like, I'm jumping in the portal and going to Notre Dame. You know what I mean? Like, that's the reality. So, yeah, I would rather get that stopover transfer kid and then bring 2 in 25, including James Flanagan. I mean, to me, if I could get James Flanagan and Nate Roberts in the 25 class, I'm doing flips. I'm fired up.
Nate Roberts is really good, man.
He's a dude. He's a much better player as a sophomore than Jaden Riddell was a sophomore. Matter of fact, I'd say they're very comparable now.
I thought Nate Roberts looked like George Kittle on film, man. He was like breaking tackles, yak stuff. I was like, oh man, it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I'm at, man. It's a dance, man. It's not as easy just load up and figure it out. That Notre Dame can't afford to do that because you know what else, Ryan? You know why Notre Dame doesn't lose as many kids in the portal? Because these kids come to Notre Dame because they want that degree. Yep. I mean, you literally had a former 4-star defensive back had the option of you can either go in the portal or you can go on an academic scholarship, stay here and get your Notre Dame degree. And he chose to not play football anymore so he could stay and get his Notre Dame degree. Talk about Philip Riley. Yeah. This isn't Alabama where they can just process kids out. You know what I mean? It doesn't. And that's not a shot at Alabama. It's just a different animal. And that's something that people got to think about. So to me, they're in a good place, Ryan. They just have to close. But it's April, right? They had 9 guys committed last year at this time. Where are they at right now?
9.
Exactly, yeah. Right. A year ago at this time, do you know how many receivers they had committed in the class last year at this time?
Big zero. Big goose egg.
Yeah. Braylon James is still 2 days away from the 1 year. We're still 2 days away from the 1-year anniversary of Braylon James committing.
And Cam Williams might be better than all of them. 2020.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Right now he's a higher grade. He's a top 50 guy for me right now.
Yeah, he's really good, man.
Yeah. So anyway, I like where Notre Dame is at. I do. Now they got to close. And there's some positions, as we said, look, guys, we gave it to you straight. Linebacker, there's some dudes on the board to make us happy, but they got to hit the inside straight, and I'm not sure they can.
Right.
That's a concern. And if they don't, we'll be critical. But how about we wait till they actually don't get a class that we like and stop assuming that it's going to happen and give them some time? Because, like, guys, it's April 17th. The Blue Gold game's in 5 days. It's time to be happy right now. It's time to enjoy life. And there's enough craziness going on in the world right now that you got to come to sports and find your joy. Like, you got to be happy, enjoy this stuff, because, I mean, I'm not going to get into it, but the world's kind of effed up right now. You know what I mean? And it's been that way for a couple years. Sure. You gotta be able to tune that stuff out and say, hey, look, man, I'm not going to bring that negativity into here because this is sports. Let's have some fun. Doesn't mean we can't be critical of stuff when it's warranted, but sometimes we're just looking for it. And so I think the lack of buzz, this is all coming around a question about lack of buzz. I think the lack of buzz has a lot more to do with us as fans than it does about where Notre Dame actually is right now.
I think Marcus Freeman also set the bar so high early on in the recruiting game, right? So you're just like matching that type of impact early. It's not an easy thing, man. Like, you set the bar high, and I mean, you gotta, there's peaks and valleys to that sometimes.
Let's go have you read this one here, Ryan, because I want to answer this one.
From Tyler Smith, he says, "Is Notre Dame having talks of going after Bear Alexander from Georgia that entered the second wave portal?"
No. Bear Alexander was at like 4 different high schools. He was just a starter on the national championship team. Correct, Ryan? Didn't he start at Georgia this year? Played a ton at Georgia this year?
He played a lot. Yeah, he did play a lot. I'm not sure if he started.
And he's transferring. Do you honestly think he's transferring because he wants to get a better education than what he's getting at Georgia? Do you think he's transferring because I just want more playing time? No.
He's projected to start this year too, so yeah.
He's looking for a payout, folks. And when that's happening, he ain't coming to Notre Dame. And to me, it's the same thing with Caleb Williams last year. Notre Dame needed to waste 0 seconds recruiting Caleb Williams last year. Why? Because he was not coming to Notre Dame. And that doesn't make him a bad kid. It just means he's looking for something that Notre Dame doesn't have to offer. Same thing with Beryl Alexander. I'm not saying he's a bad kid. I don't know the kid. I'm just telling you, based on his history, there's no way in heck a kid like that's going to look at Notre Dame. None. No. So don't waste your time, in my opinion. There's other now, safety portal, yes. They're going to be very active in the safety portal. If an elite guard comes along, they may look at him. But honestly, right now, Notre Dame is about build up the guys you have and then look for safeties. That's where you're at. Like receiver, I don't think they need to go to the portal, even with Caleb Smith being out, and even if they move Lorenzo Styles to corner. I told you, a lot's happened since you've been gone, Ryan.
I know, I've seen it.
I still think they're good, which is a far cry from where they were last year at this time. I mean, it's insane. But no, Bear Alexander's not going to be.
Sounds like he's heading west, so we'll see about that one.
Yes. Here we go. Here's one from Robert McReynolds. He says, how do you calibrate what you're seeing when watching high school film, meaning some kids' skills are going to get inflated because they are playing a much more watered down talent high school? Can I correct one thing?
Sure.
A kid's skills never get inflated or deflated. A kid's skills are what they are. If I'm a 4.5, I'm a 4.5 whether I'm going against a guy that runs a 5 flat or I'm going against a guy that runs a 4.3. I'm still a 4.5, right? If I'm a 3.9 20-yard shuttle guy or a 4.4 20-yard shuttle guy, it doesn't change because of the competition that I'm playing. So the skills don't get inflated. What I think it does, Ryan, is it makes it harder to evaluate some guys sometimes for people who don't do it for a living. And even for people that do it for a living, it can be a challenge when a guy is so much more athletic than the guys around him because they're just not that good. Right. Yeah. So I think this is the way that I would phrase it, Robert, would be different. I think calibrating high school film is a good way of putting it, but I don't think kids' skills get inflated. I think the evaluation of those skills may be off, but their skills don't change. Your skill is what it is. It just, how do you project it? And so I would say it that way. But I mean, Ryan, that's part of the craft of being a talent evaluator is looking for tricks to be able to help you, because it's also not a given that just because you dominate great competition, you're going to be a great player. Javon McKinley dominated in high school against as good a competition as any receiver has faced in the country since. Dude had 60 catches for over 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns in the playoffs, and he was going against St. John Bosco, De La Salle. I mean, they didn't play Modern Day that year. They played like Orange Lutheran. They played what's that one school Jay Sarah, I think they had like three D1 DBs.
Yeah.
I mean, he was going and he was dominating. He had an 80-yard kickoff return for a touchdown against De La Salle in the championship game. I mean, again, 60 catches and 1,000 yards in the playoffs that year. It didn't translate to the next level. So it's not just the kids that played. And Golden Tate had some of the worst high school film I've ever seen as far as who he was playing against, and he dominated at Notre Dame. Right? So it doesn't always translate. I think it has more to do with the evaluator than it does the player, in my opinion.
Well, and I would say this, the evaluating high schoolers is way more difficult than evaluating college kids going to the NFL because there's so much growth that is going to happen with the player and so much more projection that needs to kind of take place. Because, I mean, you're talking about a 16, 17-year-old kid that is going to potentially grow a couple more inches, right? Is going to gain a ton more weight. That is going to go from playing, Group 1 ball in New Jersey to playing SEC ball. Like, that's a pretty dang big jump, right? Like, all those things are interesting to consider. I would say for me, Robert, it's hyper focus on watching the player and not what's around them, right? Like, how do you evaluate how fast the kid is? I'm not watching the result of a play. The kid, had a 40-yard outside zone play, right?
Ryan, you're not watching how fast he pulls away from the competition. That's the other thing, because you don't know that. What I look at, and I will say this, Ryan, to tell you, you look at the field, you look at his legs. You've watched enough film where you can see this kid's legs are moving, or because again, some kids may move with fast legs, but they don't run fast. Some kids are like long striders that don't look like they're fast, but they're fast. You look at how much ground he's covering. You evaluate that because hey, here's the deal, Ryan. Whether it's a field out in the middle of Idaho or a field in Miami, the dimensions don't change. How quickly you cover that ground is the same because the field does the same. It's like that scene from Hoosiers, one of the greatest scenes from Hoosiers. Gets the kid on, and he's like, they measure the hoop. Hey, guys, it's still 10 feet, right? That doesn't change. And I think that's the key. But that takes time, Ryan. That takes experience, in my view. Because most people, you start watching film, when you're evaluating speed, you look at the kid or you look at what's around him. And there's other tricks that you use when you know the comp. Like if I'm watching a kid that's playing in Miami, I don't got to do that. He's pulling away from those kids, and I know who those kids are. They can run, right? Yep. But when I'm watching a kid that plays at some private school out in California, like Amir Carlisle had dominant high school film, but you're looking like this competition is bad, and you saw certain things that just didn't project well to running back at the next level, and that I think some people missed. And the position I think people have the hardest time on, Ryan, when it comes to evaluating high school players, in my opinion, based on the talent, is offensive line. Yeah. There are so many misses on just big physical kids that can't move that just dominate people in high school. And I think that's where I think the comparing them to the talent level is where you see most recruiting services and some coaches just completely whiff on those guys.
Offensive line's a really good one because you rarely ever see offensive linemen take pass sets in huddle tapes too, right? It's just about driving off the football and driving dudes into the dirt, which is nice. That's nice to have. I mean, it's not a bad thing, but it's also the full scope. And also, Robert, I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, let's call it what it is, right? A huddle highlight tape, players are putting on just their highlights. You don't see their low lights a ton, right? Like if I'm watching all 22 of an NFL draft prospect, I see every play, right? Like it's not just about the highlight tape. What happened on the negative plays? What happened everywhere in between? How consistent are they? What is the progression from game 1 to game 7? Like like those different little things you miss on a highlight tape because you're only highlighting the absolute best of what you did, and you're not always evaluating. I mean, unless I have a huddle login for a team, I can't go through every single play and really determine how good a player is on a snap-to-snap basis.
And we can find 2 to 3 games on YouTube and things like that. And it's just, but it can be a challenge. It can be a challenge, right? Because like right now, Ryan, you and I right now, we could pick up any player in the country and you and I have the same access to it. And I can watch literally, with the exception of the South Carolina game, every single snap that Joe Walt took this year. Yeah. It's almost impossible right now for me to be able to do that with Styles Prescott. Or Anthony Knapp, right? And as you mentioned, the physical jumps of there's a 220-pound offensive lineman in high school football right now. That's 220 pounds. That someday is going to be a first-round NFL draft pick. Happens every year almost, right? Well, it takes a special dude to be able to look at that kid and be like, okay, I see it. And that's why that kid ends up going to like Northern Iowa, South Dakota State, places like that, because teams don't look at that and be able to see that. And that's where you got to give Jeff Quinn and Matt Balis a lot of credit, because they saw that in Joe Alt when a lot of other people didn't. Iowa saw it, right? But a lot of other schools didn't see that until he was already a lock to Notre Dame, and it's paid off.
There's a kid that might get drafted this year out of Northern Michigan, Brian, that is an offensive tackle that is 6'7" right? and a what's that? Northern Michigan, I think, is D2. Yeah. So there's a offensive tackle this year. I forget his name, but he is a 6'7", 320-pound offensive tackle now that ran 4.88 at his pro day and is probably going to get drafted. He was a Division II basketball player and didn't even start playing college football until like his sophomore year. He transferred to Northern Michigan. He was a tight end.
Jake Witt?
Jake Witt. That's it. Okay. Yep, Jake Witt.
I don't know that. I just looked it up while you were talking.
Yeah. Athletically is one of the best offensive tackles you've ever seen come out and dress. I mean, he had like a 37-inch vert, 4.88 in the 40, just incredible stuff. But to your point, these players don't all develop at the same rates, right? Like that kid was a 240-pound tight end coming out of high school.
10 foot plus broad as an offensive
Kid's nuts,
lineman.
Man. He did like 23 reps on the bench too. It's a decent number for a D2 kid. Like
Junipero Serra, that's who it was. And they had like Brandon. I'm sorry, it just hit me. Brandon Plesser put that in there. But yeah, but that's part of the fun of it too, Robert, in my opinion, is because, like Ryan, you feel good when you do get those right. You're like, I got that one right, and that's part of the fun of it.
Absolutely.
Here's a John Moore: with our recent bad luck with Moores, we'll be able to keep Leonard Moore. Little LOL there. Yes, I feel good about that one. Leonard Moore's a different cat now. I mean, if you know anything about his family, you're like, yep, that's one thing we said at the time when as soon as we did research on his family, like, this kid's going Notre Dame. This kid's going Notre Dame. That's a family that gets it, and they have raised that young man to get it as well. In my opinion.
Very, very close relationships with the James family, which makes total sense.
Yes. Yep. Bayside Tiger 6 says, compared to previous staffs, it seems this one places more emphasis on ability to play football versus guys who would impress at a combine. Agree or disagree? I'm going to somewhat disagree with that, because that's actually something I thought for the last several years Brian Kelly and his staff did a pretty good job with. There was a lot of kids that were just football players so now I think this staff does it better, but I think that I wouldn't necessarily say that's only unique to this staff. I do think that there were some coaches on the previous staff that were pretty good at that as well, in my opinion.
Well, I think Notre Dame got a lot of freaky kids in the 2023 class as well, like kind of thinking about it. I mean, like Braylon James is both, right? Like he's not just one of
Micah
those.
Bell's both.
Micah Bell's both, right? Like Christian Gray's both. Like they're not just one or the other.
I think the emphasis that they're placing that's even greater than the previous staff, who also did a good job with it, is the previous staff's problem was they just weren't willing to go after the top guys. That was the problem. Yeah. But they would find plenty of gems. I think this staff is even more so looking for guys who have versatility than we've seen in the past. Even in the previous staff did a pretty good job of that as well. I mean, we saw, again, the guys we've talked about that are going to start at other positions that didn't at safety, that didn't start there, were all guys that were recruited by the previous staff. So I think the big difference here is there's a greater work ethic and a more of a willingness to go to battle for the top guys. I think that's one of the biggest differences. And you have a head coach that actually puts work in on a recruiting trail. Yes. That's the biggest difference, in my opinion.
Agree.
Nick McGrail asks, what are your thoughts on the Ohio State and Michigan recruiting battle going on recently? Seems like both teams have a fair deal of momentum in the 2024 class right now.
They do. I mean, Ohio State, you expect it, right?
Correct.
Michigan's actually doing Michigan's doing a really good job, though. We've had questions about them recently as far as their consistency of recruiting over the last couple of years. And I think a lot of that was due to Jim Harbaugh flirting with the NFL consistently, right? But at the end of the day, Brian, we talk about this, right? What happens on Saturday matters most to these kids, right? Winning football games. Michigan has had back-to-back double-digit win seasons. They've won Big 10, 12, 10 championships, and they've made playoff berths, right? Like that stuff matters to these kids, right? So I think that you're seeing Michigan is now taking a step up, and they're doing a better job.
Their head coach didn't botch the entire offseason.
Yes,
like Harbaugh did the year before.
Yeah.
I'll tell you this is good for Notre Dame. This is definitely good for Notre Dame because what used to Ohio, Michigan back in the day used to go into Ohio and take great players. Now, not often, but it was enough. I mean, Charles Woodson was an Ohio kid.
Yeah.
That they got there, right? And Ohio State was always good, but they would take enough of those guys to where Ohio State was really good, but maybe about 4 or 5 guys less because Michigan would take some of them and Notre Dame would take some of them. And I think that's the thing is, guys, the Northern teams being good is good for Notre Dame. It is.
Penn State's also recruiting at a nice level so far.
Very well right now. Yeah. There's four Northern schools that are right now that are recruiting where I'm like, I'll take that class and stack it up against anybody. It's Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, and Notre Dame right now. Yep. And that's a good thing. And they're not just getting kids from the South, right? Like, these kids from Texas and Florida going to Ohio State and turning into first-round picks in California. That's good for Notre Dame because there's going to come time when Ohio State isn't on that guy that Notre Dame can say, hey, look, man, you come up here, you can play in the cold, you can do this. And Penn State's putting out high draft picks at wide receiver. Ohio State's putting out high draft picks at wide receiver. We're putting out high draft picks at wide receivers. I think Notre Dame's going to have a chance to do in the next couple of years with Tobias Merriweather and potentially Deion Colsey and guys like that. Those things help. I really believe this. And I'm going to do a series this summer because Josh Pate, who I respect, was like, there's no teams that need to be good for college football. And I disagree with that. And we're going to do a series on that this summer or when we get into the offseason where we're going to have some shows where maybe are a little bit more national oriented, especially the Wednesday shows. But I do think it's good for college football when Michigan and Ohio State and Penn State and Notre Dame are all good because we remember this analogy we used a couple years ago. It's like Ohio State is like Captain America on Endgame, where it's like they're there and like Thanos and it's the SEC and all that, and it's just Captain America by himself, right? And then Notre Dame kind of is like, kind of comes in, and that's the Sam Wilson character, right? And then Black Panther comes through, that's like Michigan, and then Doctor Strange comes, that's like Penn State. Like that's good for Notre Dame because it takes there's that counterweight to the SEC dominance. And then the North, because like right now, the Alabama being great and Georgia being great helps the entire SEC because that's the league you want to be a part of, right? But now if you're the North is saying, hey, bring it, right? Bring it. Then all of a sudden it's like, okay, I go up to the North and play ball too. Like I am not super high on Luke Fickell. I hope I'm wrong. I do hope I'm wrong. Because those things benefit Notre Dame. And I know some people don't believe that, but I do because they're not going to only take kids from Notre Dame. They're going to take kids from Florida State's another one. Florida State being dominant and being really good on the recruiting trail is good for Notre Dame because they're not going to take very many kids from Notre Dame. They're going to take kids from Bama and LSU and Georgia and Clemson. That's who they're going to take kids from. So I do believe for the health of college football that there are counterweights because it also is good for the TV revenue because right now all the money's in the SEC. But if all of a sudden these other leagues, like if the Big 12 is as dominant now as it was 30 years ago, I don't know if Texas and Oklahoma leave because now the Big 12 is – there was a time where the Big 12 was like that's where like there's some big-time football being played there. And that's changed over the years. And so I think that's good for the game. I really do. I think that's good for the game. Brandon Plesner, is Logan Thomas a gap closer?
I mean, no, not for me, Brandon. Not for me. I mean, look, I think that for me, like the way that Brian in this beginning of the show kind of quantified gap closers, the two different layers of it, right? One is, are they just better than what you have? And then two is, can they take it to the next level type of thing, right? Like it could really, take that group to a higher level. I think that it helps you, a Logan Thomas, because I think he's talented, right? I think he has pretty good upside, but I don't think him just alone is a gap closer. No, I don't personally.
At the very best, he's in that second tier of gap closer where he just makes you better, but he doesn't necessarily like, oh gosh, bring on Bama now. I think from an upside standpoint, he has a chance to become one.
Possibly.
But I don't think he is right now. And there's some work to be done there. I mean, he's barely 200 pounds right now.
I think I'll say this, Brandon, to the question. I think it's pretty hard for just one individual player to be a gap closer by themselves, man. Like there's very few guys that are that. Like that's tough, man. That's hard. Yeah. Like Keon Keeley's that, right? Elijah Rushing, yes, he is one of those guys, right? But like there's only a couple guys a year probably at each position that you're like, that guy is a gap closer. Like that guy will make your team better
that
instantly.
They have a shot at. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But usually it's more like, let's get a group together and that's takes
exactly.
To the next level.
Because I made this point on the show with Tim Priester the other day. I said, look, like the 2018 defensive line for Notre Dame was as good as any in the country that year. They didn't have a single first-round talent, in my opinion. I know Jerry Tiller was picked in the first round, but I always thought he was overdrafted. I thought he was more of a third-round guy, in my opinion. They didn't have any first-round talents, but as a unit, as a whole, their starting lineup had 4 NFL guys, and they had 3 or 4 NFL guys on their second unit that year. That's where Notre Dame has got to be. Their version of Jalen Carter is Justin Scott, but that guy doesn't come along very often in your backyard. It just doesn't happen very often, right? So maybe you get Justin Scott and he becomes your Jalen Carter, but more often than not, we're good because we're just throwing 8, 9 really good football players at you, even though we don't have any elite football players. That's where the 2021 defensive line was at, Ryan. That was the 2018 defensive line was. The last time Notre Dame, I thought, had a defensive line where they had 2 like legitimate high-level guys was back in 2012 with Lewis Nix and Stephon Tuitt, but then that team lacked the depth because when those guys came off the field, there was a big drop-off between Lewis Nix and Tony Springman, right? And that's where this team is. Well, maybe they don't have a Lewis Nix and nose guard, but they got 3 dudes that can flat out play. That's where you're trying to get to. And then as you start to do that, that then creates the opportunities for you to eventually start to have a better shot at landing some of the dudes. Right. And I think that's where Notre Dame is right now. They're just not going to go get those elite defensive linemen unless they're in their backyard because they have no track record of producing high draft picks on the defensive line. Why is it so much easier for Notre Dame to go anywhere to get offensive linemen and tight ends? Because there's a track record that you can put those guys in the NFL draft.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's not because there's something unique about Notre Dame that makes them more attractive to offensive linemen or tight ends. It's because like Aaron Banks wasn't a guy that was looking at Notre Dame. I just really want to get that degree. Robert Hainsey might have been, Tommy Kramer might have been, Joe Alt maybe to a degree, but Joe Alt is looking at it, be developed as to be a master at my craft.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference. And start putting more of those guys in the NFL, and then that just ups your chances to get those guys. But yeah, I agree with him. Ray Holcraft right here, Ryan says, where's Notre Dame at in their recruitment of Elijah Rushing on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being for sure get, 5 being less optimistic? What is their chance of getting him and why?
Ray flipped the script here, man. Usually 5. Usually 5 is like you're very positive, and 1's you're very negative. But he went the other way here. I would say for me, Ray, it's like a 3 or a 4 on this scale, right? Like it's not a 0 because he's coming for an official visit, right? So obviously there's some sort of interest there, or else he wouldn't waste his time, even though official visits are unlimited now. Because why not? Sure. But he still wouldn't waste his time going up to Notre Dame if there wasn't some sort of interest. That being said, and I talked about this on the message board a little bit earlier, still a long shot, man. It still is. Like I still would not predict Elijah Rushing to Notre Dame, but apparently it's a little better than I thought it was. I thought it was
they're definitely in his top 5, right? Because he's, although there's a question about the scholarships, the unlimited official visits. I'll get into that more this week. There's also a question about our thoughts from because we're going to wrap it up after this question. There's some other team stuff. Ray Holcraft, Ian Johnson has some questions about this year to next year, spring. Guys, bring those into the chat tomorrow. We'll have more time to answer those tomorrow. We're going to wrap up with the recruiting thing here, Ryan. But look, this is I think they've got with Elijah, they have a puncher's chance.
Yeah.
Right. As of right now, they have a puncher's chance. If you get him on campus in June, you'll have a shot. But if they were the leader, I think he would have visited this spring. And now I know he visited in the winter, but if he was like, that's where I'm going to go, he would have made another visit. Now I think he likes Notre Dame. I think he's a kid that understands the benefits of what Notre Dame brings to the table, but they're going to have something different to pitch to him if they're going to get him than just the normal pitches, in my opinion.
Yeah. And he also comes from, I remember the first time I talked to him, Sal Point Catholic. Apparently that community is a very pro Notre Dame spot, apparently. So like there's he was like, I remember my initial conversation with him was like, yeah, man, everyone loves Notre Dame around here. Like they love it. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like I didn't expect to hear that from like an Arizona kid. Right. But Yeah, so I mean, I think puncher's chance is a good way to put it, Brian. Like, it's not dead in the water. There's not zero chance, obviously, but it's still a long shot. Like, it's not something that I would predict. If we did crystal balls, I wouldn't put a crystal ball in for Elijah Rushing going to Notre Dame. But again, you have a shot. You have to blow that visit out of the park, man. You have to do it to have a legitimate chance, but they have a chance is the point, though. That's the point.
And you're in the fight. Now it's about close. Because I look, as all the harshness we've had towards Al Washington as a recruiter, he can easily just shut all that up like now if he gets Elijah Rushing and Justin Scott.
Oh, no way. I won't say anything about him for like years. I'll be like, yep.
Hey, Al, my bad, baby. Roost Chris steak dinner on me, man. That's on me, right? And I hope that I'm saying that someday. I absolutely hope I'm saying that someday. But that's the opportunity that he has. I mean, look, same with Al Golden. Hey, man, you got a chance to shut us up, right? If you don't like us being critical of your recruiting, then go get Elijah Rushing and Justin Scott. If you don't like me being critical of your recruiting, then go get Kingston and go get Chris Cole and get both. You know what I mean? Hey, Mike Mickens shut people up. There were people that doubted Mike Mickens. We weren't ones, but the doubted Mike Mickens. You know what he did? Fine, I'll just go out and land these dudes and coach these guys up and make in. And okay, yeah, you guys don't think Benjamin Morris can play? All right, here we go. Let's do this thing, right? I mean, I hope that I'm sitting here saying like, hey, Big Al, my bad, baby, my bad, right? That's on me. Hey, Coach Golden, I'm sorry. I thought that your recruiting days were in the past. I thought you left them in Charlottesville. My bad, Coach. That's on me. I hope that we're doing that, man. Because if it is, then all of a sudden the buzz completely changes. It really does. Yep. And because like right now it's like Mike Mickens, like we're going to use that end game thing. Right now, Mike Mickens is like us, the defensive staff is like, he's now Cap before we know what's coming. He's all by himself, like just tightening up his broken shield. Like, okay, all right, I'm going to try to do this thing. And the other cats are still like in dust somewhere, right? We don't know that they're back yet. And that's kind of where he's at, right? And so the more guys that can step up and do that, the better I'm going to feel. Like Chris O'Leary, man, hey, partner, you need to get hey, I know you're doing a nice job coaching safeties, but this is college football, man. You just can't just be a good coach. You got to be able to recruit. And right now, you haven't shown that you can do that at a high enough level. It's time to get that done. And so they all got a shot, Ryan. I mean, we broke down the board today. They all got a shot to be that guy. Now it's time to step up and win those battles.
No doubt.
And it starts with Justin Scott on the D line, Kingston at linebacker.
Yep.
Those are two gets that if you can get that done this summer, all of a sudden a little bit of that pressure comes off, and then it makes it, hey, Elijah, you want to come play with this cat over here, Justin Scott? You know what I'm saying? Hey, let's do this, baby. Right? It makes it a lot easier to sell it. It does. It absolutely does. So that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. Hey, Brian, it was great to have you back, man. Look, we're going to have some fun Notre Dame team shows this week. We'll have some, we'll talk about, I didn't want to bring it up today because Ryan just got home yesterday. So I want to give him some time to watch some of the spring games. We will talk about the spring games that were on TV this past weekend and what we saw, preview the Notre Dame spring game, what we're looking for, takeaways. We'll have we'll do a little bit of a recruiting preview as well, probably on Thursday of the weekend, and talk team. And then, of course, we'll have a mailbag on Friday. We'll have a post-game show on Saturday. He won't be part of it because when are you coming in? When are you flying in?
I'm actually driving in, so I'm going to be driving in Friday, I think. Yeah.
You're gonna leave after the show, or you're gonna not be on the show on Friday?
I'll have to figure that out.
We'll have to discuss that later. Discuss that. Like, you just got on vacation and you're missing more shows. Come on, man. We have to have a little talk later, buddy. But it was good to have you back. But we'll have a lot to talk about this week. A lot going on. Make sure you're locked into the message board, folks, because that's where we're going to get a lot of our intel and put a lot of these notes and nuggets and things like that. You can find that at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Hey, see this Gap Closer shirt, Ryan's IB shirt, hat, all the flag we got back there, right there, all the merch we're always rocking. You all can find that down below. It'll be in the description box below. If you're listening via podcast app, I am now putting those in the description boxes as well. You can go there, buy all the Irish Breakdown merch. If you sign up for the message board and you buy an annual membership, you get 20% off the message board. So if you're wanting to get some merch and you're wanting to be a part of the board, do the board first, get the discount code in an email that I'll send you after you sign up, and then you can use that. If you're a monthly subscriber, you get a 10% off discount. So you can still get a discount even if you're a monthly subscriber. And if you sign up with the Gold Club, you not only get the 20% off discount, but you get a free IB mug that looks like this, but it has a club on it. So it's a mug club on it, right? You also get a t-shirt that's like Ryan's. It says IB Gold Club on it. So it only goes to Gold Club members. If you sign up for the Shamrock or the Blue Club or the Shamrock Club, those will get you a free mug as well. And those are just ways that those are the booster clubs for people that want to support us. We've actually now gone with this push run. We've gone over 120 members in the booster club, which is pretty awesome. So we're very fired up about that. So anyway, a lot going on. It's going to be a very busy week. I'm fired up about it. Glad to have my partner in crime back. So ready for that. Y'all, we'll see you all again tomorrow. Thanks for being with us today. Can't wait to hear it tonight. IB Nation Sports Talk, 6 o'clock. But me and you will be back tomorrow, 1 o'clock, for another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast.